Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been a park ranger for nearly 10 years now, and nothing I'd experienced had prepared me for what I was about to face. Sure, I'd heard stories. People always have stories. Tall tales of strange sightings in the woods, creatures that couldn't possibly exist. Most of the time, I'd just chuckle and wave it off, but not this time, not anymore. Because after that night, I knew, with bone-chilling certainty, that some of those stories were real. It was a typical night shift at the park. The air was crisp, the moon bright enough to illuminate the winding roads that snaked through the dense woods. It was the middle of summer, which meant the park was relatively quiet. Most tourists had packed up for the day, and the only sounds I expected to hear were the distant calls of owls or the rustling of nocturnal critters going about their business. I drove my truck down the familiar dirt road, the headlights casting long shadows against the towering pines. The silence was comforting. It was the kind of stillness I'd grown accustomed to over the years. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, the wilderness had a way of making you feel small but safe, like the world beyond the forest didn't really matter. But then I heard it. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible over the hum of the truck engine. A howl, not like a wolf's or a coyote's. This was deeper, more resonant, like it came from something bigger, a lot bigger. I turned down the radio, thinking maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The woods could do that, sometimes. But there it was again, louder this time, echoing through the trees like a low, mournful wail. I pulled over to the side of the road, shutting off the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy, oppressive even. For a moment, I just sat there, listening. The wind stirred the branches above, but beneath that the woods were eerily quiet, too quiet. I strained my ears, waiting for that howl again. When it came, it was closer, much closer. Instinctively, I grabbed my flashlight from the passenger seat, the beam cutting through the thick darkness as I stepped out of the truck. The cool night air hit me, sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I scanned the tree line, searching for movement, but there was nothing, just the vast, impenetrable blackness of the forest. Probably a wolf, I muttered to myself, though deep down I didn't believe it. There was something off about that sound, something that felt wrong. Wolves didn't sound like that. I closed the door quietly and started walking along the dirt road, my flashlight sweeping side to side. I knew these woods like the back of my hand. I'd patrolled this area countless times, day and night, rain or shine. But tonight, everything felt different. The usual comfort I felt out here was replaced by a growing unease, like the woods themselves were watching me. Then I saw them, giant claw marks carved deep into the bark of a nearby tree. I stopped, heart hammering in my chest as I moved the light closer. The grooves were fresh, the wood beneath still raw and splintered. Whatever made those marks had to be enormous. I crouched down, inspecting the ground around the base of the tree. The dirt was disturbed, tracks leading deeper into the forest. I followed them with the beam of my flashlight, noting how large they were, too large for any known animal in these parts. The howling came again. So close now I could feel it reverberate through the ground beneath my boots. I whipped my head around, pointing the flashlight into the trees, but the beam illuminated nothing but branches and shadows. My pulse quickened, my breath coming faster as I stood there, alone in the night. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard movement. Heavy footfalls, slow and deliberate, like something massive was walking just out of sight. It wasn't panicked or hurried. No, it was as if whatever it was knew I was there, and it was in no rush. My stomach twisted with dread. This wasn't right. I debated getting back into the truck and driving back to the ranger station. But something, some primal instinct I couldn't shake, made me stay. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was a sense of duty. Either way, I took a step toward the noise, my flashlight leading the way. As I moved deeper into the trees, the air seemed to change, growing colder, heavier. The wind stopped, and all around me, the world fell into an unsettling stillness. I couldn't even hear the usual nocturnal creatures. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just my own footsteps crunching over twigs and leaves. I pushed forward, heart pounding, until I came upon a small clearing. The tracks led here, and in the center of the clearing something lay on the ground. At first, I thought it was a fallen tree or some kind of debris, but as I got closer, I realized it was a carcass, a deer, or at least what was left of one. Its body had been torn apart, limbs scattered, entrails strewn across the ground like some kind of grotesque display. The fur was matted with blood, and the stench was overwhelming. I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve as I took a step back. Whatever did this wasn't just hunting for food, it was something else. I heard a low growl behind me, so deep it felt like it rattled in my chest. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. Slowly, I turned my head, the flashlight beam following my movement. There, just at the edge of the clearing, stood the creature. It was massive, easily standing over 7 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur. It walked on 2 legs, like a man, but its head was distinctly wolf-like, long snout, pointed ears, and glowing amber eyes that bore into me with an intelligence I hadn't expected. Its mouth curled back in a snarl, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. For a moment, we just stared at each other, my breath caught in my throat, my heart slamming against my ribs. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The sheer terror of the thing standing before me, something that shouldn't exist, had rooted me to the spot. Then it stepped forward, its massive claws digging into the earth with every step. My fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking wildly as I pointed it at the creature. It growled again, louder this time, the sound vibrating in the air like a warning. I knew, without a doubt, that if I didn't move now, I wasn't going to survive the night. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and bolted, sprinting through the trees as fast as my legs would carry me. Branches whipped at my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet. But I didn't care. All I could hear was the sound of my own ragged breathing and the thunderous footsteps of the creature chasing me. I ran blindly through the forest, not even sure where I was going. I just knew I had to get back to the truck. I had to get out of here. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I risked a glance over my shoulder. The creature was gaining on me, its eyes glowing in the darkness, its massive body moving with terrifying speed. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, crashing to the ground with a painful thud. I gasped, trying to push myself up, but my leg was twisted, pain shooting through my ankle. The flashlight had rolled out of my hand, its beam now pointing uselessly at the sky. I heard the creature approaching, its heavy breathing punctuating the night air. I scrambled, crawling toward the flashlight, desperation fueling me. Just as my fingers wrapped around the handle, the creature let out an ear-splitting roar, and I knew it was right behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, and shined the beam directly at it. For a split second, the creature hesitated, its eyes narrowing as the light hit its face. But it didn't stop. It lunged at me, its massive claws outstretched. Just as its hand was about to reach me, a loud crack echoed through the trees. A shot. Someone fired a gun. The creature snarled in pain, recoiling back into the shadows. Another shot rang out, and this time the creature turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness with frightening speed. I lay there, panting, heart racing, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Then from somewhere behind me, I heard a voice. "Ranger, you okay?" I turned to see a fellow ranger, his rifle still raised, looking as shaken as I felt. "Yeah," I croaked, still clutching the flashlight. "I think so." He helped me to my feet, and together we limped back to the truck, neither of us saying a word. Story 2. The howl that echoed through the twilight-shrouded forest wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a coyote. This sound was deeper, more guttural, and it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. I'd been hiking the Appalachian Trail for 3 weeks, pushing myself to my limits both physically and mentally. The solitude had been exactly what I needed after a messy breakup and quitting my soul-crushing corporate job. Out here it was just me, the mountains, and the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the trail. Until now, that howl changed everything. Suddenly, the forest that had been my sanctuary felt alien and threatening. I quickened my pace, knowing I needed to find a suitable campsite before full dark set in. The sun was already dipping below the ridgeline, painting the sky in vivid oranges and purples. Any other evening, I would have paused to admire the view. Tonight, I just wanted shelter. I found a small clearing about a half-mile further down the trail. It wasn't ideal, a bit too exposed for my liking, but it would have to do. I hurriedly set up my tent, my hands shaking slightly as I fumbled with the poles. Another howl, closer this time, made me jump and drop a tent stake. I cursed under my breath, snatching it up and finishing my work with frantic energy. As darkness fell, I huddled in my tent, my headlamp illuminating the nylon walls and casting eerie shadows. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Probably just some coyotes, maybe a bear. Nothing to worry about. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind kept whispering that I knew better. Whatever had made that sound was something else entirely. I must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion finally overcoming my anxiety. When I woke, the forest was deathly quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing, just an oppressive silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. That's when I heard it. A sound like heavy breathing just outside my tent. Then a snuffling noise, as if something was scenting the air. My heart began to race, and I could hear blood rushing in my ears. I held my breath, praying that whatever was out there would just move on. A shadow fell across my tent, massive and hunched. I could see it clearly silhouetted against the moonlit sky. It was huge, far larger than a person, with a distinctly animalistic shape. But it was standing on 2 legs. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the creature slowly circled my tent. Each footfall was heavy, deliberate. I could hear twigs snapping under its weight. It paused near the entrance, and I saw what looked like clawed fingers press against the tent fabric. I bit my lip to keep from crying out. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow moved away. I heard it crashing through the underbrush, heading deeper into the forest. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding, my body shaking uncontrollably. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay awake, straining my ears for any sound of the creature's return. As the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I cautiously unzipped my tent and peered outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The clearing around my campsite was surrounded by massive footprints, easily twice the size of my own boot. They were deeply pressed into the soft earth, with clear claw marks at the end of each toe. Whatever had made them was heavy and had passed by multiple times during the night. But it was the trees that truly terrified me. Several of the pines surrounding my clearing bore deep claw marks, some nearly 7 feet off the ground. The bark had been shredded, with long furrows gouged into the wood beneath. It looked as if something had been marking its territory, and I was camped right in the middle of it. My hands shook as I broke down my tent, shoving gear haphazardly into my backpack. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch. Every snapping twig had me whirling around in panic. I needed to get out of there, to get back to civilization and away from whatever was lurking in these woods. As I shouldered my pack and turned to leave, movement at the edge of the clearing caught my eye. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. There, partially hidden behind a massive oak, stood a figure that defied explanation. It was tall, at least 8 feet, with a broad, powerful build. Shaggy fur covered its body, a mottled brown that blended perfectly with the forest backdrop. But it was the face that seared itself into my memory, somewhere between wolf and ape, with intelligent eyes that fixed on me with an intensity that rooted me to the spot. This was no animal. There was a cruel intelligence in that gaze. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, with deliberate slowness, it stepped out from behind the tree. My survival instincts finally kicked in, and I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, heedless of the trail, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I didn't stop running until my lungs were on fire and my legs threatened to give out. Only then did I pause, gasping for breath, to listen. The forest had come alive again with the sounds of birds and small animals. Whatever that creature had been, it wasn't pursuing me. At least, not at the moment. It took me 2 days of hard hiking to reach the nearest town. I must have looked half-crazed when I stumbled into the local diner, wild-eyed and babbling about monsters in the woods. The locals exchanged knowing looks, and soon I found myself sitting with a grizzled old man who introduced himself simply as Tom. "Ain't the first time we've heard tales like yours," Tom said, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. "Folks round here call it the Dogman. Been sighted in these parts for generations." I listened, rapt, as Tom spun tales of other encounters. Hunters finding mutilated game, hikers gone missing, strange howls in the night that made even the bravest woodsman hurry home and lock their doors. "You're lucky," Tom concluded, fixing me with a steely gaze. "Most folks that get that close, well, they don't usually make it back to tell the tale." I left town the next day, my hiking plans abandoned, but as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. In my rear-view mirror, the green expanse of the Appalachians loomed, and somewhere in those ancient hills, I knew, something was waiting. The encounter changed me. I can't look at forests the same way anymore. What I saw out there defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things lurking in the wild places of the earth that science can't explain. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that howl in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those intelligent, predatory eyes, remembering how close I came to becoming just another mysterious disappearance in the vastness of the Appalachian wilderness. I don't hike alone anymore, and I always make sure I'm back in town before nightfall, because now I know the truth. When darkness falls in the deep woods, we're no longer at the top of the food chain. There are ancient, primal things out there, things that see us as nothing more than prey, and they're watching, waiting for their chance to remind us of our place in the natural order. Story 3. The crunch of bone and the ripping of fabric jolted me awake. In the pitch black of our tent, I fumbled for my flashlight, heart pounding. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a normal bear raid. This was something else entirely. My name's Alex, and I've been an avid camper for most of my life. My partner Jamie and I had been planning this backcountry trip for months. 3 days deep into the wilderness of Olympic National Park, we thought we'd seen it all. Breathtaking vistas, herds of elk, even a black bear lumbering in the distance. But nothing could have prepared us for what happened on that final night. We'd set up camp in a small clearing, hanging our food cache high in a nearby tree, as we always did. It was a perfect spot, or so we thought. A babbling stream nearby, flat ground for the tent, and a ring of old-growth trees that made us feel protected. The sound that woke me was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a weird mix of animal and something almost human. I nudged Jamie awake, pressing a finger to my lips. The noises outside grew louder, snuffling, tearing, and then a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What is that?" Jamie whispered, eyes wide with fear. I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know, but it's big." We sat frozen in our sleeping bags, barely daring to breathe. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to be ransacking our campsite. I heard our cooler being smashed, the distinct sound of our camping stove clattering across rocks, but it was the footsteps that truly terrified me, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably bipedal. This was no bear. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the sounds began to fade. Whatever had invaded our camp was moving off, its footsteps growing distant. Only then did I dare to unzip the tent and peer outside. The destruction that greeted us in the pale pre-dawn light was shocking. Our campsite looked like it had been hit by a tornado. The food cache was shredded, bits of our supplies scattered in a 50-foot radius. But it was the tracks that made my blood run cold. Massive footprints, easily twice the size of my own boot, circled our tent. They were deeply pressed into the soft earth, with clear claw marks at the tips. These weren't bear tracks, or any animal print I recognized. They were almost human-like, but distorted, monstrous. Jamie's hand gripped my arm tightly. "Alex, what the hell made those?" I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but there was no rational explanation for prints like these. "We need to get out of here," I finally managed, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "Pack up, fast as you can. We're leaving." We broke camp in record time, shoving whatever salvageable gear we could find into our packs. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us jumping, eyes darting to the tree line. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It wasn't until we tried to start the car that true panic set in. The engine sputtered and died, again and again. "No, no, no," I muttered, turning the key frantically. "This can't be happening." Jamie was scanning the woods, face pale. "Alex, we can't stay here. If that thing comes back—" I popped the hood, hoping against hope it was something simple, but as I stared at the engine, my heart sank. Deep gouges marred the metal, and several important-looking wires had been cleanly severed. This wasn't normal wear and tear. Something had deliberately sabotaged our vehicle. The implications were terrifying. Whatever had raided our camp wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. This was calculated, intelligent. It had made sure we couldn't easily escape. I slammed the hood shut, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "We're going to have to hike out. It's about 15 miles to the ranger station. If we push hard, we can make it before dark." Jamie nodded, but I could see the fear in their eyes. We both knew that 15 miles in this terrain, with limited supplies, was a tall order, and that was assuming nothing was hunting us. We set out at a grueling pace, paranoia driving us forward. Every shadow seemed to move, every distant sound had us freezing in our tracks. The forest that had seemed so welcoming just yesterday now felt oppressive, hostile. About 2 hours into our hike, we heard it. A long, mournful howl that echoed through the trees. It was answered by another, then another. The sounds were coming from all around us. "Run!" I gasped, grabbing Jamie's hand. We crashed through the underbrush, all attempts at stealth abandoned. Branches whipped at our faces, roots threatened to trip us, but we didn't slow down. The howls grew closer, accompanied by the sound of something large moving through the forest. We burst out of the tree line into a small meadow, gasping for breath. That's when we saw it, just for a moment, a massive shape at the edge of the clearing, upright, easily 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy fur. But it was the eyes that froze me in place, intelligent, predatory, and fixed directly on us. Then it was gone, melting back into the shadows with impossible speed for something so large. Did you see that?" Jamie's voice was barely a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak. What I'd seen defied explanation. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion. It was something that shouldn't exist. We pressed on, pushing our bodies to the limit. The encounters became more frequent. Glimpses of massive shapes moving parallel to our path, guttural growls from just beyond the next ridge. They were herding us, I realized with growing horror, pushing us in a specific direction, away from the ranger station and deeper into their territory. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in ominous reds, we made a desperate decision. We couldn't risk being in the open after dark. Not with those things out there. We found a small cave, really more of an overhang, and wedged ourselves inside. "What are we going to do?" Jamie asked, voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. I pulled them close, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. We'll wait until first light, then make a run for it. The ranger station can't be more than a few miles away now. But as full darkness fell, the sounds began again. Wood knocking, echoing through the forest. Strange, guttural vocalizations that were almost, but not quite, words. And footsteps, huge, heavy footsteps, circling our pitiful shelter. We huddled together, barely breathing, as shadows moved across the entrance to our cave. Massive, hunched shapes that blocked out the stars. I could hear them breathing, smell a musky animal scent that made my nose wrinkle. They knew exactly where we were. And they were toying with us. The night stretched on endlessly. Every time exhaustion threatened to overtake us, a howl or a shadowy movement would jolt us back to terrified alertness. It was psychological warfare, and our unseen tormentors were masters at it. Just before dawn, the noises stopped. The forest fell silent in a way that was almost more terrifying than the chaos of the night. Slowly, cautiously, we emerged from our shelter. The sight that greeted us stole the breath from my lungs. Our little overhang was surrounded by those massive footprints, overlapping and crisscrossing in the soft earth. But it was the trees that truly drove home the nature of our situation. Long, deep claw marks scored the bark, some nearly 8 feet off the ground. It was a clear message. This is our territory. You are not welcome here. We ran. We ran like we'd never run before, caution thrown to the wind. Every shadow seemed to move, every tree potentially concealing one of those monstrous forms. The howls started again, but this time they were behind us. We'd passed some invisible boundary, and our tormentors weren't pursuing. When we finally stumbled into the ranger station, wild-eyed and babbling, we were met with a mix of concern and knowing looks. The head ranger, a grizzled old man named Tom, sat us down with strong coffee and listened to our story without interruption. "You're not the first," he said finally, his voice grave. "We get a few of you every season. Folks who've seen things out there that don't fit with how they think the world works." "What were they?" I managed to ask, my hand still shaking around my coffee mug. Tom shook his head. "Officially, nothing. Doesn't exist. Unofficially, well, these forests are old. There's things out in those deep woods that science can't explain, things that have been here a lot longer than us, and they don't take kindly to visitors." We left the park that day, but the experience never left us. I still camp, still hike, but never without a nagging fear in the back of my mind. Because now I know the truth. When you venture into the wilderness, you're not at the top of the food chain. There are ancient, primal things out there, things that see us as intruders, as prey, and they're watching, waiting for their chance to remind us of our place in the natural order. Story 4. When you've spent as much time in the forest as I have, you start to think you've seen everything. I've hiked more trails, camped in more remote locations, and wandered deeper into the woods than most people ever dream of. The wilderness had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could escape, clear my head, and lose myself in the sounds and smells of nature. But all that changed one summer evening when I found myself following a set of footprints I should have never chased. That night, I realized there are things in the forest that don't want to be found, things that shouldn't be disturbed. I was about 5 miles into the hike when I first saw the footprints. I'd left early in the morning to beat the summer heat, hoping to explore a trail deep in the Pacific Northwest that most people avoided. It was the kind of trail that was barely marked, winding through dense forests and across rocky streams. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, with only the occasional bird call or rustle of leaves breaking the silence. That's when I noticed them, the footprints. At first, I didn't think much of them. People do hike out here, though rarely. But as I knelt down for a closer look, something about them didn't sit right. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own boots, and deeply imprinted into the soft earth as though the creature, or person, that made them weighed far more than any human should. I touched the edge of the print, running my fingers along the outline. It was fresh. I stood, glancing around, but there was no sign of anyone else. No other tracks, just this one enormous set of footprints leading deeper into the woods. I should have turned back right then, but curiosity has always been my downfall, and the thought of something this big wandering the same trail I was on intrigued me more than it should have. So against my better judgment, I followed. The footprints led me off the marked path, deeper into the underbrush where the trees grew closer together, their thick branches blocking out most of the sunlight. The forest here was older, wilder. Moss clung to everything, trees, rocks. Even the ground itself was soft and spongy beneath my feet. The air was cooler too, a damp chill settling in the deeper I went. As I walked, the forest became unnervingly quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the wind stirring the leaves. It was as though the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. The only sound was my own breathing, growing louder in the silence, and the soft crunch of my boots as I trailed the prints. I followed them for what must have been another mile when they abruptly stopped in the middle of a small clearing. I stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the ground where the last footprint lay. The tracks didn't turn or fade away. They just stopped, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished. I frowned, glancing around the clearing. The air here was thick, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere was heavier. Something about the place felt wrong. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural grunt coming from somewhere in the trees. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I could identify. It was too deep, too deliberate, like the growl of something massive and angry. Slowly, I turned in the direction of the noise, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Nothing, just the endless shadows cast by the dense canopy above. But then I saw it. Just for a moment, out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape moving between the trees. It was fast, far faster than anything that size had any right to be. I caught only a glimpse, a massive, hulking figure moving on two legs, vanishing almost as quickly as it appeared. My breath caught in my throat. What the hell was that? Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave now before whatever it was decided to make another appearance. But instead, I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my ears. The clearing felt suffocating, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. Another grunt, this time closer. I whipped around trying to pinpoint the source, but the forest had swallowed the sound. The trees seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer, darker. My mind raced, my thoughts tumbling over each other as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, what I was hearing. It couldn't be real. None of this made sense. Then the smell hit me, thick, musky, like wet fur and something rotten, decaying. It was overpowering, filling the clearing like a fog, and I gagged, covering my mouth and nose with my sleeve. Whatever it was close, too close. I started backing away, my eyes darting from tree to tree, my body tense, ready to bolt. But before I could move, the growling came again, this time right behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my trembling hand, and there it was. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just inside the tree line, was the creature. It towered over me, easily 8 feet tall, its broad, muscular body covered in thick, matted hair. Its head was massive, almost ape-like, but with a flat nose and wide, glaring eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Its hands, if you could even call them hands, were enormous, with thick fingers that ended in sharp, black claws. It stood on 2 legs, hunched forward slightly, its mouth twisted into a snarl, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at this thing, this impossible creature standing just a few feet away from me. My brain refused to process it, refused to believe what my eyes were seeing. But there it was. Every terrifying detail burned into my memory. The creature took a step toward me, its footfall heavy, deliberate. My heart raced, panic setting in as I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The flashlight beam flickered wildly, bouncing off the trees as I struggled to keep it steady. Then it growled, low and menacing, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I knew, in that moment, that I was no longer the one doing the observing. I was the prey, and it was letting me know. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I bolted back through the forest, branches whipping at my face, the underbrush grabbing at my legs as I sprinted blindly in the direction I'd come from. My lungs burned, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. But behind me, I could hear the creature moving, crashing through the trees, its heavy footfalls closing in. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. The thought of seeing it again, chasing me, was too much. I just ran, my legs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. The forest was a blur around me, my only focus on getting as far away from that thing as possible. The growling grew louder, more guttural, as if it was getting closer, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had to get back to the trail, back to the safety of the familiar, open path. If I could just make it there. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. I yelped as I tumbled down a steep incline, the world spinning around me as I hit rocks and branches on the way down. My body twisted, pain shooting through my shoulder as I finally came to a stop at the bottom, groaning in agony. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, trying to get my bearings. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. I held my breath, listening, waiting for the sound of the creature crashing after me, but there was nothing, just the steady thrum of my pulse and the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. Cautiously, I sat up, wincing at the sharp pain in my side. My flashlight was gone, lost somewhere in the fall, but the dim light filtering through the trees above was enough for me to see that I was in some kind of ravine. The walls were steep, but climbable. I glanced around, my heart still racing, half expecting the creature to appear at any moment, but the forest had returned to its unsettling quiet, as though nothing had ever been there. No footprints, no massive hulking shape, just the trees, the shadows, and the lingering sense that something was still watching. I didn't waste any more time. I forced myself to my feet, ignoring the pain, and started climbing out of the ravine. Every movement felt sluggish, my body aching from the fall, but I pushed through it. I had to get out of there. It felt like hours before I finally stumbled back onto the trail, panting and covered in sweat and dirt. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the path, but I didn't stop. I kept walking, my pace quickening with each step until I was practically jogging back to the trailhead. By the time I reached my car, night had fully fallen. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locking the doors with shaking hands before starting the engine. The headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the empty road ahead. I didn't look back. As I drove away from the forest, my mind raced, replaying every detail of what I'd seen. The creature, the footprints, the guttural growls. I knew what it was, what it had to be, Sasquatch. But I also knew one thing for certain. I would never ever go back into those woods again. Story 5. People think they know what fear is. They think it's the rush they get from a horror movie or the unease of walking home alone at night. But real fear, real, bone-deep terror doesn't leave you. It clings to you, sits in your chest, and waits for any excuse to remind you it's there. I thought I knew fear. I was wrong. That night in the Canadian wilderness taught me otherwise, because no campfire story, no urban legend had ever prepared me for the Wendigo. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Me and my 3 buddies, Scott, Ryan, and Dave, decided to venture up north, deep into the woods where the air was crisp and the lakes were untouched. We'd been camping together for years, and this was just another one of those weekend getaways to escape from work and the pressures of everyday life. We'd been doing it long enough to feel like we knew the wilderness better than most. We weren't even worried when the locals warned us about venturing too far from our campfires at night. "Stay close to the light," one old man had said when we stopped for gas in a tiny, forgotten town on the way up. His face was weathered, skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too frail to hold him up. Strange things happen out there after dark. We laughed it off, of course. Every small town has its spooky stories meant to scare tourists. We weren't buying it. But still, when night fell on our first night in the woods, the way the darkness pressed in around us felt different, heavier. The trees felt like they were watching us, closing in, even though I could still hear Scott and Ryan bickering about the best way to cook the steaks over the fire. Dave sat next to me, staring into the flames, his face lit by the flickering orange glow. "You ever hear of the Wendigo?" he asked, his voice low, almost as if he didn't want the trees to hear him. I chuckled. "Gee, you've been listening to too many podcasts." "No, seriously," he insisted, leaning in closer. "It's an old native legend. They say it's a spirit or creature that roams the woods, especially in the winter. It used to be human, but turned into a monster, craving human flesh. It's got this endless hunger, and it mimics voices, lures people into the forest, and then, well, you get the picture." Scott scoffed, flipping the steaks. "Come on, Dave. Don't start that crap. We're here to relax, not scare ourselves to death," I agreed, but the way the wind suddenly picked up and rustled the leaves made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Still, I shrugged it off. It was just another ghost story. And besides, we weren't exactly in the heart of winter. The weather was cool, sure, but not cold enough for a Wendigo, if such a thing even existed. After dinner, we sat around the fire for a few more hours, swapping old stories and laughing, the crackling flames keeping the chill at bay. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, and the forest around us was pitch black. I noticed Ryan glancing over his shoulder more than once, but I didn't say anything. The darkness does strange things to people, especially when they've had a few beers. Eventually, Dave got up and announced he was heading into the woods to take care of business, as he put it. We all laughed, and he grabbed his flashlight, disappearing into the tree line. That's when things got weird. About 10 minutes passed, and Dave still hadn't come back. Scott joked about him falling into the lake or getting lost, but there was an edge to his voice. We were all feeling it, the sudden heaviness in the air, the oppressive silence that seemed to fall over the forest. "Maybe we should go check on him," Ryan said, his usual cocky tone replaced with uncertainty. "Give him a minute," I replied, though the unease was creeping into my voice too. He probably just wandered a little further than he thought. But another 5 minutes went by, and still nothing. I stood up. "All right, I'll go find him. Probably tripped over a log or something." Scott and Ryan both stood up as well, clearly as uncomfortable as I was. I grabbed my flashlight, and the three of us walked to the edge of the camp, calling Dave's name. "Dave, you good?" Nothing. We listened, straining our ears for any sound, any hint of movement, but the forest was still, too still. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. A low, almost distant voice drifted through the trees. Hell. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakably Dave's voice. "Did you hear that?" Ryan asked, his eyes wide. I nodded, heart pounding in my chest. "Dave," I called again, louder this time. "Where are you? Help!" The voice came again, closer this time but wrong. Something about the tone was off, like it was struggling to mimic him. It was quieter, weaker, but it was definitely his voice. At least, it sounded like him. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I stepped toward the trees, flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam cut through the darkness, but it was barely enough to pierce the thick woods ahead of us. Scott grabbed my arm. "Wait, man. This doesn't feel right." But what were we supposed to do? Leave him out there? "Stay by the fire," I told them. "I'll go a little further. Maybe he's hurt. We can't just—" A twig snapped to our right, and we all jumped. The voice came again, closer now, but this time it wasn't right. It sounded like Dave, but it was distorted, almost like it was coming from a broken speaker. "Help!" I aimed the flashlight in the direction of the voice, and that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a shadow among shadows, standing just beyond the reach of the light. But then it moved. My stomach dropped. The thing that stepped into the light wasn't Dave. It wasn't even human. It stood on two legs, taller than any man, its body gaunt and twisted, its skin, if you could call it that, clung tight to its bones, stretched and grey like a rotting corpse. Its eyes, God, its eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to suck in the light. And its mouth was too wide, stretching impossibly far, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim glow of my flashlight. The worst part, it was wearing Dave's clothes, or at least what was left of them, torn and ragged, hanging off its skeletal frame like a mockery of what it had taken. And then, in that horrible, broken imitation of Dave's voice, it spoke again. "Help! Me!" Ryan screamed. Scott froze, his face pale as a ghost. I couldn't move and couldn't breathe. I just stared at the thing as it took a slow, deliberate step toward us, its long, bony fingers twitching, reaching. That's when the smell hit me. Decay, rot, death. It was overwhelming, choking, and I gagged, stumbling back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Run," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. But Scott didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the thing, his face slack with terror. "Scott, run!" I shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him with me. We bolted, Ryan right behind us, the three of us crashing through the underbrush, branches slapping against our faces and arms. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it, that thing, the heavy, uneven footsteps behind us, moving faster than something that size should be able to. Its voice, that awful mimicry of Dave's, echoed through the trees. "Help! Me!" We didn't stop until we burst back into the clearing, the fire still crackling weakly in the center of our camp. I grabbed a log from the pile next to it and shoved it into the flames, feeding the fire until it roared to life. Scott and Ryan were gasping for breath, their faces pale and covered in sweat. "What the hell was that?" Ryan panted, his eyes wide with panic. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the locals had warned us, and we hadn't listened. The thing didn't follow us into the clearing. It stayed just beyond the light of the fire, its dark shape barely visible between the trees. But I could feel its eyes on us, watching, waiting. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed huddled by the fire, keeping it burning until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. When the sun finally rose, we packed up as fast as we could and left. We didn't talk about what we saw. We didn't even look at each other. We just wanted to get out of there. We never found Dave. Not a trace. His voice still haunts me. Those broken words, that pleading tone. But it wasn't him. Whatever we heard in those woods wasn't Dave anymore. It was something else. Something older. Something hungry. And it's still out there, waiting for the next fool who strays too far from the fire. Story 6. The distress call crackled through our radio, breaking the pre-dawn silence. A hiker, lost somewhere in the vast expanse of Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. Little did we know, answering that call would plunge us into a nightmare beyond anything we'd ever encountered in our years of search and rescue. My name's Sarah, and I've been with Mount St. Helens Search and Rescue for over a decade. I thought I'd seen it all, stranded climbers, injured hikers, even the occasional standoff with an angry bear. But nothing could have prepared me for what we found in those woods that day. Our team of 4 loaded up the truck as the sun began to peek over the horizon. Me, our team lead Jake, and 2 newer members, Liv and Marco. The mood was focused but light as we went over our gear one last time. Standard stuff, first aid kits, ropes, GPS units. We'd done this 100 times before. The hikers' last known location put them deep in the backcountry, a good 6-hour hike from the nearest access road. As we drove, Jake briefed us on the few details we had. Solo hiker, male, mid-30s, missed his check-in yesterday evening. Last contact was garbled. Something about weird noises and feeling like he was being watched. Liv, always the optimist, piped up from the back seat. "Probably just got spooked by a coyote or something, right?" I nodded, but couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Something about this felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on why. We parked at the trailhead and set out, falling into the familiar rhythm of a long hike. The forest was beautiful in the early morning light, mist still clinging to the towering pines. But as we pushed deeper into the wilderness, an oppressive silence settled over us. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the crunch of our boots on the trail and our own measured breathing. About 4 hours in, Marco spotted something off the trail. Guys, over here." We gathered around, staring at a battered backpack hanging from a branch. It was shredded, as if something with massive claws had torn into it. The contents were scattered on the ground below. Energy bars, a crushed water bottle, a map torn to pieces. Jake frowned, examining the damage. "This isn't normal animal behavior. Bears don't string up backpacks like this." A chill ran down my spine. He was right. This was deliberate, almost like "a warning," I said softly, voicing what we were all thinking. We spread out, searching the area for any sign of our missing hiker. That's when I saw it, a faint trail of disturbed undergrowth leading away from the backpack site. And right at the edge, barely visible in the soft earth, a single, massive footprint. My breath caught in my throat. The print was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot. And the shape, it was almost human-like, but distorted, with clear claw marks at the ends of the toes. "Jake," I called, my voice shakier than I'd like to admit. "You need to see this." He crouched beside me, eyes widening as he took in the print. For a moment, he was silent, and I could see him struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew to be possible. "Okay," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "And we follow the trail, but we stay together. No one wanders off alone. Understood?" We all nodded, the gravity of the situation sinking in. This wasn't a normal search and rescue anymore. We were tracking something else. The trail led us deeper into the forest, to areas I'd never seen in all my years of SAR work. The trees here were older, massive trunks disappearing into a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, and that unnatural silence persisted. We found more signs as we went, broken branches far too high up to be caused by any normal animal, more of those massive footprints, and once, a tuft of coarse, dark hair snagged on a thorny bush. Marco bagged it as evidence, though we all knew no lab would be able to identify it. As the day wore on and shadows lengthened, we came upon a clearing that stopped us in our tracks. The ground was littered with bones, deer, elk, and some that looked disturbingly human. In the center stood a crude structure of sticks and hides, like some primitive shelter. "What the hell?" Liv whispered, her face pale. Jake was all business, though I could see the tension in his jaw. "Marco, Liv, check the perimeter. Sarah, with me. We're going to examine that." Structure. As we approached, the stench hit us. Decay and something musky. Animal. Jake pulled back one of the hide flaps, revealing a dark interior. Our flashlight beams cut through the gloom, illuminating scattered belongings. A torn jacket, a single boot, a crushed cell phone. "It's his stuff," Jake said grimly. "But where is he?" A twig snapped behind us, and we whirled around. Liv and Marco were hurrying back, eyes wide with fear. "We need to go," Marco said, his voice urgent. "Now." "What did you see?" I asked, already dreading the answer. Liv swallowed hard. "We found a cave just beyond those trees. There were scratches on the walls, and symbols, like some kind of primitive writing. And the smell—" She trailed off, shuddering. Jake nodded sharply. "All right, we're calling this. Whatever's out here, it's beyond our capabilities. We need to get back and bring in more resources." We turned to leave, and that's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a primal fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. "Run," Jake whispered. "Now!" We took off, crashing through the underbrush. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, branches snapping under immense weight. A howl split the air, answered by others from different directions. We were being hunted. I lost track of time as we ran, lungs burning, driven by pure adrenaline and terror. Glimpses of massive, fur-covered shapes flitted through the trees around us. Those inhuman howls grew closer, then faded, as if our pursuers were toying with us. Just when I thought my legs would give out, we burst from the tree line onto a Forest Service road. Our truck sat there, a beautiful sight I never thought I'd be so glad to see. We piled in, Jake gunning the engine before the doors were even fully closed. As we sped away, I looked back. There, at the edge of the forest, stood a figure that defied explanation. Massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares, somewhere between ape and wolf, with eyes that gleamed with terrifying intelligence. It watched us go, making no move to pursue further. We drove in shell-shocked silence for a long time before Liv finally spoke up. "What? What do we tell them back at base?" Jake's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "The truth. We tell them exactly what we saw. Let them try to explain it away." But I knew, deep down, that no explanation would ever truly capture the horror of what we'd encountered. Those things out there, they weren't animals, weren't anything science could classify. They were something ancient, something that had been in those woods long before humans arrived, and would likely be there long after we're gone. In the days that followed, a massive search operation was launched. They never found our missing hiker, of course, nor did they find any trace of the creatures we'd encountered. The official report cited animal attack, probable bear, case closed, but we knew the truth, and we'd never look at the wilderness the same way again, because now we understood. When you venture into those deep, dark woods, you're not the apex predator. There are things out there, ancient and powerful, that see us as nothing more than prey. I still work search and rescue, but I'll never go back to that part of the forest. Some places are better left unexplored, some mysteries better left unsolved, because the truth is far more terrifying than anything we could imagine. And out there, in the shadows of the ancient pines, they're watching, waiting, reminding us that we're not as high on the food chain as we'd like to believe. Story 7. The stench hit me first, a nauseating mix of rotting meat and something musky, animal. Then I saw it, what was left of the deer carcass. It wasn't just killed, it was torn apart, viscera strewn across the forest floor like some macabre decoration. This was no ordinary predator kill. Something was very, very wrong in these woods. I'm Alex Reeves, forest ranger for the Cascade Mountain region. 15 years on the job, and I thought I'd seen it all. Bear attacks, cougar kills, even the occasional wolf pack taking down elk. But this was different. The reports had been trickling in for weeks. Mutilated wildlife, strange tracks, eerie howls that didn't quite sound like any animal native to these parts. It was time to investigate. The morning had started like any other. I'd geared up at the station, checked my rifle, more for show than anything else, I rarely had cause to use it, and headed out into the crisp autumn air. The forest was a riot of color, all reds and golds under a clear blue sky. Hard to believe anything sinister could be lurking in such beauty. I'd been hiking for about 3 hours when I came across the deer. The violence of the scene was shocking. This wasn't a clean kill for food, it was almost vengeful. Like whatever did this enjoyed the destruction. I knelt to examine the tracks around the carcass, and my blood ran cold. These weren't bear prints, or any predator I recognized. They were huge, easily twice the size of my hand, with distinct claw marks at the tips. And they were bipedal. "What the hell?" I muttered, standing up and scanning the tree line. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just an oppressive silence that pressed in from all sides. I keyed my radio, trying to keep my voice steady. "Base, this is Reeves. I've got a situation out here in Sector 7. You're going to want to send backup." Static crackled back at me. "Copy that, Reeves. What's the nature of the situation?" I hesitated. How could I explain what I was seeing without sounding crazy? Large predator kill, unusual tracks. I'm going to investigate further, but I've got a bad feeling about this one. Understood. Backup's on the way. Be careful out there, Alex. I clicked off, taking a deep breath to steady myself. Part of me wanted to wait for backup, to not face whatever was out here alone. But I knew my duty. If there was a dangerous predator in these woods, I needed to track it, to protect any hikers or campers who might be in the area. The trail of destruction wasn't hard to follow. Broken branches, more of those massive footprints, and disturbingly, what looked like claw marks gouged into tree trunks nearly 7 feet off the ground. Whatever made these was big, and it walked on 2 legs. As I pushed deeper into the forest, the terrain became rougher. The well-maintained trails gave way to old-growth forest, massive trees blocking out most of the sunlight. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, and that unnatural silence persisted. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. After about an hour of tracking, I came upon a small clearing. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk easily 10 feet in diameter, and there, at the base of the tree, was a cave entrance. Dark, foreboding, and reeking of that same musky odor I'd smelled at the deer carcass. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to wait for backup, but I knew that whatever was in there could be long gone by the time help arrived. Steeling myself, I clicked on my flashlight and approached the cave. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a passage that sloped downward into the earth. The walls were smooth, almost unnaturally so, and covered in strange markings. They looked almost like writing, but no alphabet I'd ever seen. Some of the symbols seemed to move in the flickering light, creating unsettling illusions of motion. I'd taken no more than a few steps into the cave when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very rock around me. It wasn't the sound of any animal I knew. This was deeper, almost intelligent. My heart racing, I swung my flashlight beam deeper into the cave. For just a moment, I caught a glimpse of something that defied explanation. A massive shape, easily 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy dark fur. But it was the eyes that froze me in place, glowing in the darkness, reflecting my flashlight beam back at me. And in those eyes, I saw something that shook me to my core. Intelligence, cruel and ancient. Then it was gone, melting into the shadows with impossible speed for something so large. I stumbled backward, out of the cave, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to run, to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. But I forced myself to stay, to observe. It was my job, after all. For hours, I watched the cave entrance from a hidden vantage point. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in reds and purples, I heard movement from within the cave. Not just one creature, but many. Low growls and guttural vocalizations that were almost but not quite words. They emerged as darkness fell. 3 of them, each easily 8 feet tall, covered in thick fur that seemed to absorb the remaining light. They moved with a fluid grace that belied their massive size, loping off into the forest on 2 legs. I waited until I was sure they were gone before making my move. I knew I should leave, report what I'd seen, but I needed evidence, something concrete to back up the insane story I'd have to tell. Gathering my courage, I re-entered the cave. The stench was overwhelming now, a mix of rotting meat and that musky animal smell. My flashlight beam revealed piles of bones in the corners, some disturbingly human-looking. But it was the far wall that drew my attention. Crude paintings covered the rock face. They depicted hunts, but not like any cave paintings I'd ever seen. The hunters were massive, bipedal creatures, shown taking down prey that dwarfed normal humans. And the style, it wasn't primitive. These were recent, drawn with skill and an unsettling attention to detail. I snapped photos frantically, my hands shaking. I needed to document everything before a roar from the cave entrance cut off my thoughts. One of them had returned. I spun around, coming face to face with a nightmare made flesh. It filled the entrance, massive and terrifying. But it was the eyes that truly horrified me. There was intelligence there, and a malevolence that was all too human. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and that thing. I could hear it pursuing, branches snapping under its weight, that terrible roar echoing through the trees. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. My lungs burned, my legs threatened to give out. But fear kept me going, driving me forward. Finally, blessedly, I broke through the tree line onto a Forest Service road. My truck sat there, a beautiful sight I never thought I'd be so happy to see. I threw myself into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life just as a massive shape burst from the trees. I caught one last glimpse of it in my rearview mirror as I sped away, a hulking silhouette against the night sky, watching me go. I drove straight to the ranger station, my mind reeling. How could I explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? As I pulled up, I saw my backup had finally arrived. 2 other rangers, looking concerned and a bit annoyed at being called out so late. "Alex, what the hell happened out there?" my supervisor, Jim, asked as I stumbled out of the truck. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I took a deep breath, trying to collect my thoughts. "Jim, we've got a situation. There's something out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist." I told them everything, showing them the photos I'd managed to take. To their credit, they listened without interruption, though I could see the disbelief in their eyes. In the days that followed, a massive search was launched. They combed the area where I'd seen the creatures, but found nothing. No cave, no paintings, not even the deer carcass. It was as if the forest had swallowed all evidence of what I'd encountered. The official report cited an unidentified large predator, possibly a bear. Case closed. But I knew the truth. Those things were still out there, watching, waiting, and I knew that I'd never look at the wilderness the same way again. Because now I understood. When we venture into the deep woods, we're not the apex predators. There are things out there, ancient and powerful, that see us as nothing more than prey. And they're always watching, reminding us that we're not as high on the food chain as we'd like to believe. Story 8. People always ask me why I don't hike anymore. They don't get it. When I try to explain, they laugh it off, assuming I'm telling some over-the-top ghost story. But I'm not. I wish I was. The truth is, there are things out there in the woods, things that shouldn't exist, and I know that because I saw one, and I barely made it out alive. It was a late fall evening, crisp and cool in Michigan's dense backcountry. The woods stretched on for miles, untouched, untamed, the perfect place for someone like me, someone who thrived in the solitude of nature, who found peace in the quiet stillness of the trees. It was why I'd come here, to get away from everything, clear my head, and reconnect with the world before winter set in. I'd been hiking all day, cutting through dense pines and crunching over dead leaves. My plan was to reach a small clearing by nightfall and set up camp. The sun was already beginning to sink behind the trees, casting long shadows across the trail, but I wasn't worried. I knew this forest like the back of my hand. It wasn't my first solo trip out here. I was only a mile or so from the clearing when I first heard it, a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It came from somewhere off to my right, deeper into the trees. I stopped, my hand instinctively tightening on the strap of my backpack as I listened. At first, I thought it was a wolf. Michigan has wolves, but they're rare. They avoid people. But this growl, it wasn't like any wolf I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more guttural, and it carried through the forest in a way that made my stomach twist. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired after a long day of hiking. Still, I quickened my pace, eager to reach the clearing and set up camp. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. Wolves don't stalk people, and they don't make a sound like that. It almost sounded like something bigger. My eyes scanned the dense underbrush, but all I could see were the shadows cast by the fading light. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, tracking me. I started walking again, faster this time, my heart racing as the trees around me seemed to close in. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone anymore. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my pulse spike. I was almost running by the time I finally reached the clearing, panting, my breath visible in the cold evening air. The small clearing was surrounded by towering pines, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I dropped my pack and quickly set up my tent, the whole time glancing nervously over my shoulder. The growling had stopped, but the eerie silence that followed was somehow worse. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the wind and the heavy, oppressive quiet. Once the tent was up, I built a fire as quickly as I could, the flames flickering and casting long shadows around the clearing. I told myself it was fine, that whatever I heard was probably just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it, an unease that had settled in my chest and refused to leave. I sat by the fire, the warmth calming my nerves a little, but I couldn't relax. My eyes kept darting to the edge of the clearing, where the trees loomed dark and silent. I hadn't seen any movement, but that didn't mean anything. The forest was full of things that knew how to hide. As night fell, the fire became my only source of light. I tried to eat, but my stomach was too knotted with anxiety. Every little sound made me jump, the crackling of the fire, the rustling of leaves. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway and creak ominously, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Then I heard it again, that growl, low, deep, and unmistakable. But this time it wasn't coming from the woods, it was behind me. I froze, my body going rigid as every instinct screamed at me to turn around, but I didn't want to. I didn't want to see what was there, standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath shallow and fast. Slowly, with every ounce of courage I could muster, I turned my head, the fire casting flickering shadows across my face, and there it was, standing just outside the glow of the fire, barely visible in the darkness, was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. At first glance, it looked like a massive wolf, its fur dark and matted, but it was too big, far too big, and it wasn't on all fours. It was standing like a man, its massive, muscular body hunched slightly, its arms hanging low, ending in claws that glinted in the firelight. Its head was wolf-like, with pointed ears and a long snout, but its eyes were what truly terrified me. They were glowing, a sickly yellow-orange color that seemed to pierce through the darkness, locking onto me with an intelligence that no animal should have. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just stared at each other, the fire crackling between us, casting flickering shadows on the ground. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing, but nothing made sense. It was like my brain refused to accept that this thing could exist, that it was real. Then it growled again, deep and rumbling, a sound that reverberated through the ground and into my bones. It bared its teeth, long and sharp, saliva dripping from its maw as it took a slow step toward me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as panic surged through me. My body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The creature took another step, moving with an unnatural grace for something so large, its eyes never leaving mine. And then it lunged. I don't know how I moved so fast, but I did. I grabbed the burning log from the fire, swinging it wildly in front of me as the creature barreled toward me. The flames roared, the heat intense, and for a split second the creature hesitated, snarling and snapping its jaws as it backed away from the fire. I didn't waste any time. I threw the log toward it, the flames scattering across the ground as I turned and ran, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I ran blindly into the trees, branches whipping at my face and arms as I sprinted through the dark forest, not caring where I was going, only that I had to get away. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, its snarls echoing through the trees. It was fast, too fast. Every step I took felt like it was gaining on me, the sound of its footfalls growing louder, closer. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest as I tore through the forest. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I was dead. The creature let out a furious howl, so loud it seemed to shake the very trees around me. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and in the dim moonlight, I saw its hulking shape charging after me, its glowing eyes locked onto me with terrifying intensity. I ran for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The forest was a blur around me, the ground uneven and treacherous. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Eventually, I burst out of the trees and onto a narrow dirt road, my legs nearly giving out as I stumbled to a stop. I turned, expecting the creature to be right behind me, but it was gone. The forest stood silent and still, the darkness impenetrable beyond the tree line. For a long moment, I just stood there, gasping for breath, my heart racing, my body shaking with adrenaline. But the creature didn't reappear. The forest remained quiet, as though nothing had ever happened. I didn't care. I wasn't about to wait around to see if it would come back. I made my way down the road, my legs weak and trembling, barely able to hold me up. I walked for what felt like miles until I finally reached the small cabin I'd parked my car near earlier that day. Without thinking, I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped away, not daring to look back. I haven't been back to the woods since that night. I don't know what I saw out there, whether it was a dogman, a werewolf, or something else entirely. All I know is that it was real, and it was hunting me. So yeah, I don't hike anymore. And I sure as hell don't go camping alone. Story 9. I used to be the kind of person who loved camping alone. There was something about the solitude, the quiet rustle of leaves, the crackling of the campfire. It made me feel alive. I'd pack my gear, hike into the wilderness, and spend a few days disconnected from the noise of everyday life. But one night, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, that all changed. Nappy, I don't go into the woods without a weapon, and I never go alone, not after what I saw out there. I was 3 days into a week-long solo backpacking trip, miles away from any other people or signs of civilization. The trail I was following wasn't one of the popular routes. It was a remote, winding path that cut through dense forest, crossed rocky streams, and climbed steep ridges. It was perfect, the kind of trip I'd been craving for months. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, the sky bleeding deep oranges and purples as I set up camp on a small flat patch nestled between 2 ridges. The view from my tent was incredible. I could see the valley below, a blanket of green stretching for miles, and the distant peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains fading into the evening mist. I felt a deep sense of peace as I built my fire, the crackling flames warming the chilly air that came with the fading light. As the fire blazed, I sat back against my pack, watching the stars slowly wink into view, one by one. The night was cool but calm, and the sound of crickets and the occasional owl filled the quiet. It was perfect. Just me, the mountains, and the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. But then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first it was faint, so faint I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it at all. A rustling, like something moving through the underbrush far off in the distance. I didn't think much of it at first. Could have been a deer or some other animal. This was their home, after all. I went back to tending the fire, the warmth of the flames licking at my skin. But then it came again, louder this time, closer. I straightened up, my eyes narrowing as I listened carefully. It wasn't just the rustling of leaves. There was something heavy, deliberate, about the way it moved. It wasn't the quick, darting sound of a small animal. It was something larger, much larger, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the woods surrounding my camp, the beam cutting through the darkness. My heart beat a little faster as I scanned the tree line, the dense brush casting long, jagged shadows in the artificial light. Nothing, just trees, bushes, and the distant glint of the creek down in the valley. Still, the unease settled in the pit of my stomach. I'd been in the wilderness enough times to know when something didn't feel right. I turned off the flashlight and sat back down, telling myself I was just on edge from being out here alone. I poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers dance into the night sky. The crackling flames were the only sound now, filling the void left by the silence of the forest around me. And then I heard it again, this time unmistakably close. A deep, guttural growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My body tensed, and I stood up slowly, flashlight in hand, heart pounding in my chest. The growl was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't a bear. I'd encountered bears before, and they didn't sound like that. This was something deeper, something primal, something that sent a shiver down my spine. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness again, shaking slightly in my hand as I moved it from tree to tree. The night felt oppressive, as if the darkness itself had weight, pressing in around me, suffocating the sounds of the forest. The crickets had stopped. The owls had gone silent. It was just me, the fire, and that thing, whatever it was, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. And then I saw them, eyes, glowing, yellow eyes, staring back at me from the shadows between the trees. They were too high off the ground to be an animal, at least not any animal I was familiar with. And they didn't blink. They just watched me, cold, calculating, like a predator sizing up its prey. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I knew I should move, do something, but my body refused to cooperate. Fear rooted me to the spot, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. Then the eyes blinked once, and the thing stepped forward into the dim light cast by the fire. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur that glistened in the faint light of the fire. But it wasn't just the size that terrified me. It was the way it moved. It wasn't on all fours like a bear or a wolf. It was standing, upright, its long arms hanging low, ending in claws that were too long, too sharp. Its face was a twisted mockery of something canine, like a wolf, but wrong. Its snout was elongated, and its mouth hung open slightly, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. And those eyes, those glowing, unblinking eyes stayed fixed on me, filled with a hunger that chilled me to my core. My mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I'd heard stories, rumors about creatures like this, dogmen, werewolves, but they were just myths, tall tales told around campfires. They weren't supposed to be real, but this thing, standing just feet from my campfire, was very real. And it was watching me. The growl came again, low and rumbling, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. It took another step toward me, and I backed up instinctively, my flashlight shaking in my trembling hand. "Get back!" I shouted, my voice hoarse and shaky. I grabbed a burning log from the fire and held it out in front of me like a makeshift torch, the flames crackling and spitting as the heat intensified. The creature hesitated, its eyes narrowing slightly as it watched the fire. For a moment, I thought maybe the flames would be enough to keep it at bay. But then it let out a bone-chilling snarl, a sound so deep and menacing it seemed to vibrate through my entire body. It lunged. I stumbled backward, barely managing to swing the burning log in its direction. The flames flared, and the creature recoiled, snarling, its massive claws swiping at the air between us. I swung again, the fire crackling as I tried to keep it at bay, my heart racing in my chest. My mind was a blur of panic and adrenaline. I needed to get out of there, now. With the creature momentarily distracted, I turned and bolted for the trees, leaving my camp behind. I ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps, branches slapping at my face and arms as I crashed through the underbrush. Behind me, I could hear it, crashing through the woods, its heavy footfalls growing louder, closer. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The forest was a dark maze, the trees closing in around me, but I kept running, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. I could still hear it, chasing me, its snarls echoing through the night. Finally, I saw it. An old, crumbling hunting cabin nestled in the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. I didn't think. I just ran toward it, throwing myself through the door and slamming it shut behind me. The wood groaned under the force of my weight, and I quickly shoved an old chair against the door, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was my ragged breathing, my pulse racing in my ears. Then I heard it, a deep, guttural growl just outside the door. I backed away, my hands shaking, searching the dark cabin for anything I could use as a weapon. But there was nothing, just broken furniture and dust-covered walls. The growling grew louder, and I could hear the sound of claws scratching at the wood. The door creaked under the pressure, the wood splintering slightly. My mind raced, panic flooding my veins as I realized the flimsy old cabin wouldn't hold for long. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. The growling faded, and the forest outside went silent. I waited, barely daring to breathe, listening for any sign that the creature was still out there, but there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the wind and the distant rustle of leaves. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for the sound of claws on wood to return. When morning finally came, I stepped outside, the bright light of day chasing away the shadows of the night before. There were no tracks, no sign of the creature that had stalked me through the forest, but I knew what I'd seen. I packed up my camp and left that day, not stopping until I was miles away from the mountains. I haven't been back since, and I never will. Story 10. The trees shouldn't have fallen like that. I've hiked the Pacific Crest Trail more times than I can count, and I've seen my share of downed trees. But this was different. Massive pines, centuries old, ripped from the earth as if they were saplings. Something impossibly strong had been through here, and as the eerie sound of wood knocking echoed through the forest, I realized with growing horror that it might still be nearby. My name's Mike, and I've been a trail guide on the PCT for over a decade. This particular trip was supposed to be routine, a small group of experienced backpackers, a week-long trek through some of the most beautiful wilderness in the Pacific Northwest. But from the moment we stumbled upon that unnatural clearing, I knew we were in for something far beyond the usual trail hazards. There were 5 of us, myself, a couple in their 30s named Tom and Sarah, and 2 friends in their 20s, Jess and Alex. We'd been on the trail for 3 days, making good time and enjoying the crisp autumn weather. The group had bonded quickly, sharing stories around the campfire each night. It felt like any other trip I'd led 100 times before, until we rounded that bend in the trail and saw the devastation before us. "Holy shit," Alex breathed, summing up what we were all thinking. The trail ahead was completely blocked. At least a dozen massive trees lay crisscrossed like fallen giants, their root systems exposed and dripping soil. But it wasn't just the scale of the destruction that set my nerves on edge. It was how unnatural it looked. I've seen plenty of storm damage in my years on the trail. Trees toppled by high winds fall in predictable patterns. This looked deliberate, like something had systematically uprooted each tree and laid it across our path. "Mike, what could have done this?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with worry. I shook my head, trying to keep my own unease out of my voice. "Not sure. Maybe a microburst. They can do some crazy damage." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The sky had been clear for days, and the damage was far too localized. "We'll need to find a way around," I said, forcing myself into guide mode. "It's not safe to try and climb over. Let's scout the perimeter, see if there's a clear path." We spread out, careful not to get too far from each other. I examined the fallen trees more closely, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Deep gouges marred the trunks, like claw marks from something impossibly large. And there, in a patch of soft earth, was a footprint that defied explanation. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot. The shape was almost human-like, but distorted, with clear claw marks at the ends of the toes. I'd heard stories, of course. Every hiker on the PCT trades tales of Bigfoot around the campfire, but I'd always dismissed them as just that, stories. Now, staring at that massive print, I wasn't so sure. A shout from Jess snapped me out of my thoughts. "Guys, over here! I think I found a way through." We regrouped, following Jess to a narrow gap between two fallen trees. It would be tight, but we could squeeze through single file. As we prepared to navigate the obstacle, a sound echoed through the forest. A sharp, percussive noise, like someone striking a hollow log. Then another, from a different direction. Wood knocking. I'd heard about this phenomenon, always associated with Bigfoot sightings. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the knocks were answered by others, creating a disconcerting rhythm that seemed to surround us. "What is that?" Tom asked, his eyes darting nervously between the trees. "Probably just a woodpecker," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come on, let's get moving. We want to make camp before dark." We pressed on, squeezing through the gap and picking our way carefully over the debris field. The wood knocking continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but never quite stopping. It felt like we were being herded, guided in a specific direction by unseen watchers. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig had us all on edge. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, small animals scurrying in the underbrush, were conspicuously absent. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We made camp that night in a small clearing, the mood somber and tense. No one wanted to voice the fears we were all feeling. As darkness fell, the wood knocking intensified, punctuated by low, guttural howls that were unlike anything I'd ever heard before. "Mike," Sarah whispered, her face pale in the firelight. "What's really going on here?" I sighed, knowing I couldn't keep up the pretense any longer. "I'm not sure, but whatever it is, it's not normal. Those fallen trees, the footprints, these sounds. I've never seen anything like it in all my years on the trail." "You don't think it's actually—" Alex trailed off, unable to say the word we were all thinking. "Bigfoot," I finished for him. A week ago, I'd have laughed at the idea. Now, I don't know what to believe. We decided to set watches through the night, 2 people, awake at all times. I took the first shift with Jess, both of us scanning the tree line nervously. The sounds continued, sometimes so close it felt like whatever was making them must be just beyond the firelight. It was during the darkest part of the night, just before dawn, that it happened. I was dozing lightly, Tom and Sarah on watch, when a crashing sound jolted me awake. Something massive was moving through the forest, heading straight for our camp. We scrambled to our feet, huddling together as the noise grew closer. Trees swayed and branches snapped under the weight of something far larger than any known animal. And then, just at the edge of our clearing, it stepped into view. Even in the dim firelight, the creature was unmistakable. At least 8 feet tall, covered in thick dark fur, with a face that was somewhere between ape and man. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. There was intelligence there, and a sort of cruel curiosity as it regarded our group. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stood frozen, staring at something that shouldn't exist. Then, with a speed that belied its massive size, it was gone, melting back into the shadows with barely a sound. No one slept for the rest of the night. As soon as the first grey light of dawn appeared, we broke camp, all thoughts of continuing our hike abandoned. Our only goal now was to get back to civilization as quickly as possible. We practically ran down the trail, every shadow seeming to move, every sound a potential threat. The wood knocking continued, always just out of sight, herding us along. It wasn't until we rounded a bend and saw the ranger station in the distance that the sounds finally stopped. We burst into the station, wild-eyed and babbling. The ranger on duty, a grizzled old man named Jim, listened to our story without interruption. When we finished, he sighed heavily. "You're not the first," he said, his voice grave. "We get a few of you every season. Folks who've seen things out there that don't fit with how they think the world works." "You mean you know about them?" I asked. Stunned, Jim nodded slowly. "Been in these woods for 40 years. There's things out there, old things, that don't take kindly to visitors. We try to keep people away from their territory, but sometimes—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Official policy is to deny everything, of course. Can't have panic, can't have hordes of monster hunters trampling the forest, but you've seen them now. You know the truth." In the days that followed, as we all tried to process what we'd experienced, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brushed up against something ancient and powerful, something that had been in those woods long before humans arrived, and would likely be there long after we're gone. I still work as a trail guide, but I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Because now I know the truth. When we venture into those deep, dark forests, we're not the apex predators. There are things out there, watching and waiting, reminding us that we're not as high on the food chain as we'd like to believe. And sometimes, if you're deep enough in the backcountry, you might hear that eerie wood knocking. If you do, my advice is simple. Turn around, go back the way you came. Because out there, in the shadows of the ancient pines, they're always watching, and they don't take kindly to trespassers in their domain. Story 11. The claw marks shouldn't have been there. Not 700 feet up a sheer rock face, not gouged inches deep into solid granite. As I stared at the impossible grooves next to our bivouac, the howl that echoed across the valley confirmed my worst fears. We weren't alone on this mountain, and whatever was out there with us was no ordinary predator. I'm Alex Reeves, professional climber and occasional mountain guide. I've scaled peaks on every continent, faced down blizzards, avalanches, and my fair share of ornery wildlife. But nothing in my 15 years of climbing could have prepared me for what we encountered on the north face of Mount Olympus. Our team was small but experienced, just me, my longtime climbing partner Jake, and a talented up-and-comer named Mia. We'd been planning this ascent for months, aiming to open a new route on one of the most challenging faces in the Olympic range. The first 2 days of the climb had gone smoothly. We were making good time, the weather was holding, and spirits were high as we set up our portal-edge camp on a narrow ledge for our second night on the wall. That's when things started to get weird. I was the first to notice the marks, just as the last light of day was fading. At first, I thought it was just an odd shadow play on the rock face, but as I ran my hand over the gouges, I felt my stomach drop. These were fresh, the edges still sharp, and they were massive, each groove easily as wide as my palm. "Jake, Mia," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Like, you need to see this." They joined me, expressions shifting from curiosity to confusion to barely concealed fear as they examined the marks. "What the hell could have made these?" Mia whispered, her eyes wide. Jake, ever the pragmatist, shook his head. "Has to be some kind of equipment damage, maybe a haul bag swinging in high winds." But we all knew that wasn't true. No piece of climbing gear could gouge solid granite like this. And the placement. These marks were deliberate, almost like territorial scratching from some impossibly large animal. As if in answer to our unspoken fears, a howl split the night air. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a pitch that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't the cry of any wolf or coyote. It was deeper, more guttural, and carried an almost human-like quality that sent chills down my spine. We huddled in silence on our portal edge, straining our ears for any further sounds. The night passed fitfully, none of us able to sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. Every gust of wind, every settling of the rock face had us starting awake, imagining massive shapes moving in the darkness. As the first grey light of dawn broke over the mountains, we faced a decision. The smart move would be to descend, to get off this mountain and away from whatever was out there. But we were climbers, drawn to the challenge, the unknown, and if I'm being honest, a part of me needed to know what had made those marks. "We push on," I said, meeting Jake and Mia's eyes. "But we stay alert. Anything feels off, we bail, no questions asked." They nodded, a mix of fear and determination on their faces. We broke camp quickly, eager to get moving. As we ascended, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced down or across the valley, I caught flickers of movement just at the edge of my vision. But whenever I tried to focus, there was nothing there. We made good progress through the morning, the physical exertion helping to calm our nerves. But as we approached a difficult section of the climb, things took a turn for the worse. Jake was leading, navigating a tricky overhang when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very rock itself. Jake froze, his face pale as he looked back at us. "Tell me you heard that." Before we could respond, a massive shape leapt across a ravine to our left. It was too far away to make out details, but the sheer size of it was staggering. Easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, it cleared a gap that would have been impossible for any normal animal. "Holy shit!" Mia breathed, her knuckles white on her climbing rope. We watched, transfixed, as the creature disappeared into a stand of stunted pines, clinging to the mountainside. For a moment, none of us spoke, trying to process what we'd just seen. "We need to get off this mountain," Jake said, his voice shaky. "Oh, now," I nodded, my mind racing. "Okay, let's just stay calm. We'll rappel down from here. Shouldn't take more than a few hours to reach the base." We began our descent, moving as quickly as safety would allow, but with each rappel, with each glance across the valley, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded. The howls started again, echoing from multiple directions, and with growing horror, I realized they were getting closer. About halfway down the face, disaster struck. Mia was on rappel when a rock the size of a basketball came hurtling down from above. It missed her by inches, slamming into the cliff face and exploding in a shower of fragments. She screamed, swinging wildly on her rope. "Mia!" I yelled. "Are you hit?" She shook her head, visibly shaken but unharmed. That's when I saw it. The rock hadn't just fallen, it had been thrown. And there, on a ledge about 100 feet above us, stood a figure that defied explanation. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with a powerful, ape-like build covered in thick, dark fur. But it was the face that froze me in place. Somewhere between man and beast, with eyes that gleamed with terrifying intelligence. It regarded us for a moment, then picked up another boulder as if it weighed nothing. "Move!" I shouted. "Get to that ledge, now!" We scrambled for safety as the creature hurled rock after rock. One glanced off Jake's helmet, nearly sending him spinning off the wall. We finally reached a wide ledge, pressing ourselves against the cliff face as our attacker roared in frustration. For hours, we huddled there, too terrified to move. The creature paced above us, occasionally sending down more rocks or letting loose one of those bone-chilling howls. As night began to fall, the temperature dropped rapidly. We were exhausted, dehydrated, and dangerously exposed to the elements. "We can't stay here," Jake said through chattering teeth. "We'll freeze to death if that thing doesn't get us first." I nodded, my mind racing for a solution. That's when I remembered. There was an old climber's hut about a mile down the mountain. If we could reach it, we'd have shelter and a radio to call for help. "Okay, listen up," I said, laying out the plan. "We're going to rappel down in the dark. No headlamps. Move as quietly as possible. That thing seems to have better night vision than us, but if we're lucky, we can slip past while it's distracted." It was a desperate plan, but it was all we had. We waited until the creature's pacing took it to the far side of the ledge above, then began our descent. The next hour was the most terrifying of my life. Every sound seemed magnified in the darkness, the whisper of rope through carabiners, the scrape of boots on rock. Several times we heard the creature moving above us, and we froze, hardly daring to breathe. By some miracle, We made it down without being spotted. As soon as our feet hit solid ground, we ran. The hut was just visible in the moonlight, a tiny oasis of safety. We burst through the door, slamming it behind us and collapsing on the floor. The radio crackled to life as we called for emergency evacuation. As we huddled in the hut, waiting for rescue, the howls started again. Closer now, filled with rage and frustration, something massive slammed against the side of the hut, making the whole structure shudder. We held our breath, praying the old building would hold. Just before dawn, we heard the blessed sound of helicopter rotors. As we were airlifted to safety, I caught one last glimpse of the creature. It stood at the tree line, watching us go. In that moment, I knew that what we'd encountered was something ancient, something that didn't belong in our modern world, and I knew that I'd never look at the mountains the same way again. The official report cited a rogue bear, driven to unusual aggression by territory encroachment, but we knew the truth. Out there, in the deepest wilderness, there are things that defy explanation, things that remind us that we're not as high on the food chain as we'd like to believe. I still climb, still guide others up mountains. But now, when I hear strange sounds in the night or catch a flicker of movement just out of sight, I remember. And I know that sometimes it's better to turn back, because in the remote corners of the world there are ancient eyes watching, and they don't take kindly to trespassers in their domain. Story 12. The symbols on the cave walls shouldn't have been there. Ancient pictographs, sure. Even modern graffiti wouldn't have surprised me. But these were something else entirely. Intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move in the flickering light of my headlamp. And as I ventured deeper into the cavern, the pile of bones and tattered clothing told me I wasn't the first to discover this place. I just might be the last to leave it alive. My name's Daniel Reeves, and I've been a hunter for most of my life. Growing up in rural Montana, I learned to track deer before I could drive. But in all my years stalking game through the wilderness, I'd never encountered anything like what I found in those caves. It was supposed to be a routine hunting trip. Just me, my rifle, and a week in the backcountry during elk season. I'd been coming to this particular area for years, drawn by its remoteness and abundant wildlife. The first few days went smoothly enough. I'd spotted a promising bull elk and was tracking it through a series of narrow valleys. That's when I found the caves. They were well hidden, the entrance barely visible behind a stand of gnarled pines. If I hadn't been following the elk's trail, I never would have noticed them. Something about the opening made me uneasy. It was too perfect, almost like it had been carved rather than formed naturally. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a quick look inside. The moment I stepped into the cave, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath fogged in front of me as I switched on my headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing smooth walls that seemed to absorb the light, and there, just beyond the reach of daylight, were the first of the symbols. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Not quite hieroglyphics, not quite modern writing. They seemed to flow across the rock face in intricate patterns, creating shapes that hurt my eyes if I looked at them too long. Some seemed to pulse faintly, as if lit from within. "What the hell?" I muttered, reaching out to touch one of the symbols. As my fingers brushed the cool stone, a jolt ran through my body. Static electricity, I told myself, just the dry air in the cave. But a part of me knew that wasn't true. I should have turned back then. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out, to return to the familiar world of sunlight and open skies. But something compelled me to press on, to see what other secrets this cave might hold. As I ventured deeper, the symbols became more complex, more unsettling. Some seemed to move in my peripheral vision, rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. The air grew thicker, filled with a musty organic scent that made my nose wrinkle. That's when I saw the bones. They were piled haphazardly in a small alcove, a mix of animal and what looked disturbingly like human remains. Scraps of tattered clothing clung to some of the bones, faded and rotting. My stomach churned as I examined the grisly scene. Whatever had done this wasn't interested in food. This was something else, something darker. I was about to turn and run when I heard it. A sound like dry leaves rustling, coming from deeper in the cave. Then another noise, a low, guttural growl that raised the hair on the back of my neck. It wasn't the sound of any animal I knew. Heart pounding, I retreated to the cave entrance, but as I turned to leave, I found my path blocked by a figure that defied explanation. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Antlers sprouted from its skull, branching out in unnatural patterns, but it was the face that truly terrified me. Gaunt, almost skeletal, with eyes that glowed with an eerie, pale light. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I could feel the creature's gaze boring into me, filled with an ancient alien intelligence. Then it spoke, its voice a raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Hunter," it said, the word dripping with disdain, "you trespass in our domain." I fumbled for my rifle, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip it. What are you?" I managed to choke out. The creature's mouth stretched into a grotesque approximation of a smile. "We are the old ones, the forgotten, the hungry." It took a step towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I raised my rifle, squeezing off a shot more out of reflex than any real hope of harming the thing. The bullet passed through it as if it were made of smoke, ricocheting off the cave wall in a shower of sparks. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and that thing. I could hear it pursuing, its eerie whisper echoing through the trees. "You cannot escape us, Hunter. We have marked you. We will find you." I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. My lungs burned. My legs threatened to give out. But terror kept me going. As the sun began to set, I finally broke through the tree line into a small clearing. My truck was there, a beautiful sight I never thought I'd be so happy to see. I threw myself into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, spraying gravel in my wake. In my rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the creature. It stood at the edge of the clearing, those glowing eyes fixed on me. Then it melted back into the shadows of the forest. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. As I sat in a dingy diner, hands shaking around a cup of coffee, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination, some kind of cave gas or exhaustion-induced nightmare. But I knew, deep down, that it had been real. In the days that followed, I did some research. The area where I'd been hunting had a history of strange disappearances and unexplained phenomena. Local indigenous legends spoke of ancient spirits that guarded hidden places in the mountains, entities that were neither alive nor dead in any way we'd understand. I reported what I'd found to the authorities. Of course, they searched the area but found nothing. No caves, no bones, no strange symbols. It was as if the entire experience had been wiped from existence. The official report cited possible bear activity and recommended avoiding the area. But I knew the truth. Those things were still out there, watching, waiting, and sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that raspy whisper on the wind. "We have marked you, Hunter. We will find you." I don't hunt anymore. Can't bring myself to enter the deep woods, knowing what might be lurking in the shadows, but I feel compelled to share my story, to warn others. Because now I understand. When we venture into the wilderness, we're not the apex predators. There are things out there, ancient and powerful, that see us as nothing more than prey. If you're ever hiking or hunting in remote areas, and you come across a cave that seems just a little too perfect, a little too inviting, turn back. Don't let curiosity get the better of you, because some secrets are better left undiscovered. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And out there, in the deepest, darkest parts of the wilderness, there are entities that remember when this world was theirs. They're patient, they're hungry, and they're always watching, waiting for unwary travelers to stray into their domain. So the next time you're in the backcountry and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, trust your instincts. Get out of there, because you never know when you might stumble upon something that defies explanation, something that reminds us that we're not as high on the food chain as we'd like to believe. And if you ever see symbols on a cave wall that seem to move when you're not looking directly at them, run, run, and don't look back, because the Wendigo is real, and it's always hungry for more. Story 13. The first wood knock echoed through the forest like a gunshot, freezing us in our tracks. The second, moments later, came from a different direction. By the third, a chill had settled deep in my bones. This wasn't some hiker playing games. These were coordinated signals, and as the eerie howl rose from the valley below, I realized with growing horror that we were being hunted. My name's Sarah Chen, and I've been a wilderness guide for over a decade. I've led trips through some of the most remote parts of the Pacific Northwest, facing down everything from sudden snowstorms to ornery black bears. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what we encountered in the depths of the Olympic National Forest. Our group was small but diverse, just me and 4 clients. There was Mike, a middle-aged software engineer looking to disconnect from technology for a week, Emily and Jack, newlyweds on an adventure honeymoon, and finally, Darius, a quiet grad student who seemed more interested in the local flora than socializing. The first 2 days of our week-long trek had gone smoothly. The weather was perfect, cool and clear, with stunning views of snow-capped peaks in the distance. We'd covered good ground, pushing deeper into the backcountry than most casual hikers ever ventured. It was on the morning of the 3rd day that things started to get weird. We broke camp early, aiming to reach a particularly scenic ridgeline by midday. But as we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest felt too quiet, the usual chatter of birds and small animals noticeably absent. Probably just a cougar in the area, I reassured the group when Emily mentioned the silence. Nothing to worry about. They usually avoid humans. But deep down, I knew this was different. I'd been in cougar country plenty of times, and it had never felt like this. This was something else entirely. We'd been hiking for about 2 hours when we came across the first obstacle, a massive tree, freshly fallen, blocking our path completely. This wasn't unusual in itself. Windstorms could topple even the mightiest pines. But as I examined the trunk, my unease grew. The break was too clean, the roots torn from the earth with impossible force. "We'll have to find a way around," I announced, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's backtrack a bit, see if we can pick up a game trail to bypass this." As we searched for an alternate route, the first wood knock rang out. It was loud, deliberate, and distinctly unnatural. My head snapped up, eyes scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it, just for a moment, a flash of movement. Something large, much larger than a person, slipping between the trees. Before I could process what I'd seen, another knock answered the first, this time from behind us, then another. Off to our left, we were being surrounded. "Sarah!" Mike's voice was tense. "Oh, what's going on?" I opened my mouth to respond, to offer some rational explanation, when the howl cut through the air. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a pitch that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't the cry of any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more guttural, and carried an almost human-like quality that sent chills down my spine. We need to move," I said, my guide training kicking in despite my fear. "Now, stay close, stay quiet." We set off at a brisk pace, no longer concerned with following the official trail. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Wood knocking, strange howls, impossible strength. The pieces were coming together to form a picture I didn't want to believe. As we pushed through the underbrush, I became aware of movement paralleling our course, massive shapes flitting between the trees, always just at the edge of clear visibility. The wood knocks continued, sometimes so close it felt like they must be right next to us. "Oh, God," Emily whimpered, clinging to Jack's arm. "What are those things?" I shook my head, unwilling to voice the impossible conclusion I was reaching. "Just keep moving. We need to find open ground." But with each step, it became clearer that we were being herded. Every time we tried to veer towards what I thought was the direction of the ranger station, a particularly loud knock or growl would force us to change course. We stumbled into a small clearing, and for a moment I felt a surge of hope. Open space, better visibility. But that hope died as I realized what we were seeing. The clearing was filled with structures, crude lean-tos made of branches and bark, strange totems fashioned from bones and feathers, and everywhere those same unnatural symbols I'd glimpsed carved into tree trunks along our route. "Sarah," Darius spoke up for the first time in hours, his voice shaky. This isn't human, is it?" Before I could answer, a chorus of howls erupted from the forest around us. They were close now, too close, and they were angry. "Run!" I shouted, all pretense of calm abandoned. We crashed through the underbrush, blind panic driving us forward. I could hear them pursuing, branches snapping under immense weight. Twice, I felt the rush of air as something massive swung just over my head. We burst out onto a logging road, lungs burning, legs weak from exertion. My mind raced, trying to orient us. If we could follow this road, we might have a chance of reaching civilization. That's when I saw it. A figure, massive and terrifying, standing in the middle of the road about 100 yards ahead. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur. But it was the face that froze me in place. Somewhere between ape and man, with eyes that gleamed with terrifying intelligence. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I could feel the creature's gaze boring into me, assessing, calculating. Then with deliberate slowness, it raised one enormous hand and pointed back the way we'd come. The message was clear, this far and no further. Slowly, carefully, I backed away, gesturing for the others to do the same. The creature watched us go, making no move to pursue. As we retreated into the forest, I caught glimpses of other shapes moving among the trees. We were being escorted out of their territory. For hours, we hiked in tense silence, always aware of our unseen watchers. The wood knocks and howls continued, but now they seemed to be guiding us rather than threatening. As the sun began to set, we finally emerged onto a well-maintained trail. In the distance, I could see the lights of the ranger station. We stumbled into the station, wild-eyed and babbling. The rangers listened to our story with a mix of concern and what I could swear was knowing resignation. They mounted a search of the area, of course, but found nothing. No structures, no strange carvings, no giant footprints. It was as if the entire experience had been wiped from existence. The official report cited confusion due to extreme stress and recommended we stick to marked trails in the future. But as we waited for our ride back to civilization, the old ranger who'd taken our statement pulled me aside. "You're not the first," he said quietly, his eyes grave. "We get a few of you every season. Folks who've seen things out there that don't fit with how they think the world works." "You mean, you know about them?" I asked. Stunned, he nodded slowly. "Been in these woods for 40 years. There's things out there, old things, that don't take kindly to visitors. We try to keep people away from their territory, but sometimes—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Official policy is to deny everything, of course. Can't have panic, can't have hordes of cryptid hunters trampling the forest. But you've seen them now. You know the truth." In the days that followed, as we all tried to process what we'd experienced, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brushed up against something ancient and powerful. Something that had been in those woods long before humans arrived and would likely be there long after we're gone. I still work as a guide, but I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Because now I know the truth. When we venture into those deep, dark forests, we're not the apex predators. There are things out there, watching and waiting, reminding us that we're not as high on the food chain as we'd like to believe. And sometimes, if you're deep enough in the backcountry, you might hear that eerie wood knocking. If you do, my advice is simple. Turn around, go back the way you came. Because out there, in the shadows of the ancient pines, they're always watching, and they don't take kindly to trespassers in their domain. Story 14. I never believed in monsters, not until that day in the Cascade Mountains when I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that haunts my dreams to this day. It was supposed to be a simple, solo hiking trip. A chance to clear my head after a messy breakup and reassess my life choices. I'd done plenty of backcountry hikes before, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to encounter in those remote woods. The first 2 days of my trek were uneventful. I reveled in the solitude, the crisp mountain air filling my lungs as I navigated the rugged terrain. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, a welcome change from the constant noise of the city. On the 3rd day, everything changed. I had just crested a small hill when I saw them, a line of massive footprints pressed into the damp earth of a small clearing. At first, I thought they must belong to a bear, but as I got closer, my blood ran cold. These weren't bear tracks. They were unmistakably humanoid, but far too large to belong to any person I'd ever seen. I knelt down to examine them more closely, my heart pounding in my chest. Each print was easily twice the size of my own foot, with 5 distinct toes clearly visible in the soft soil. Whatever had made these tracks was bipedal and incredibly heavy, judging by the depth of the impressions. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the tracks were fresh. The edges were still crisp, undisturbed by wind or rain. Whatever had left them had passed through this clearing very recently. I stood up, suddenly very aware of how alone I was in this vast wilderness. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful just moments ago, now felt oppressive and threatening. Every shadow held the potential for danger. Every rustle of leaves a possible sign of some unseen predator. I debated turning back, retracing my steps to the safety of civilization. But curiosity, that damned human trait that's gotten our species into so much trouble over the years, got the better of me. I had to know what had made those tracks. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos of the footprints. Then, against my better judgment, I began to follow the trail. The tracks led me deeper into the forest, away from the well-worn hiking paths I'd been following. The underbrush grew thicker, forcing me to push through tangles of ferns and low-hanging branches. All the while, those massive footprints continued, a silent guide leading me into the unknown. As the day wore on, the light began to fade. The towering evergreens blocked out much of the waning sunlight, plunging the forest floor into an eerie twilight. I knew I should stop, set up camp for the night, but something drove me forward. I had to see where these tracks led. It was then that I heard it, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, straining my ears to locate the source. Was it thunder, a distant rock slide, or something else entirely? The sound came again, closer this time. It was a deep, guttural vocalization unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite a growl, not quite a roar, but something in between that sent shivers down my spine. I realized with growing horror that I'd made a terrible mistake. Whatever had left those tracks was still out there, and I had foolishly followed it into its territory. Panic set in. I turned to retrace my steps, but in the growing darkness, everything looked the same. The trees loomed over me, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. I stumbled forward, no longer caring about stealth, just desperate to put as much distance between myself and that terrifying sound as possible. I don't know how long I ran, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but fear drove me onward. Finally, I spotted a small opening in the base of a cliff, a shallow cave that might offer some protection. Without hesitation, I dove into the cave, pressing myself against the cold stone wall. My breath came in ragged gasps as I struggled to calm myself, to listen for any sign of pursuit. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own panicked breathing. Then I heard it, the snap of a branch, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Something was out there, moving through the forest with surprising stealth for its size. I held my breath, praying that the darkness of the cave would conceal me from whatever was passing by. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by that same low, rumbling vocalization I'd heard earlier. It was so close now that I could feel the vibrations in my chest. I pressed myself further into the cave, my eyes straining to see through the gloom, and then I saw it. Illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, a massive silhouette moved past the entrance of my hiding place. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but far larger than any man I'd ever seen. Shaggy hair covered its body, and its arms hung long at its sides, nearly reaching the ground. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a trick of the light and my overstimulated imagination. But as the creature paused at the cave entrance, I knew with terrifying certainty that what I was seeing was all too real. It turned its head slowly, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought it was looking directly at me. I could make out the gleam of its eyes in the darkness, intelligent and somehow ancient. In that instant, I felt like a small, insignificant creature facing something far beyond my understanding. The standoff seemed to last an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then, with a soft grunt, the creature moved on, continuing its journey through the darkened forest. I remained frozen in place long after the sound of its footsteps had faded away. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. But there was no denying the evidence of my own eyes. I had just encountered something that shouldn't exist, something that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. As the adrenaline began to wear off, exhaustion set in. I knew I couldn't stay in this cave forever, but the thought of venturing back out into the forest terrified me. What if there were more of those creatures out there? What if the one I'd seen decided to come back? I spent a fitful night in that cave, jumping at every sound, my imagination conjuring terrifying scenarios with each crack of a twig or rustle of leaves. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I made a decision. I had to get out of these woods, back to civilization where I could try to make sense of what had happened. With shaking hands, I checked my GPS and plotted the quickest route back to the trailhead where I'd left my car. It would be a long journey, one that would take me dangerously close to where I'd last seen the creature, but I had no choice. I couldn't stay here. I emerged from the cave cautiously, my eyes darting in every direction, searching for any sign of movement. The forest seemed peaceful in the early morning light, but I knew now that appearances could be deceiving. What other secrets did these ancient woods hold? As I made my way back through the wilderness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig made me jump, every shadow held the potential for danger, but nothing emerged to confront me, and eventually I reached the safety of my car. It's been months since that encounter in the Cascade Mountains, but I still can't shake the memory of what I saw. I've researched countless cryptid sightings, spoken to experts in the field, and even considered going public with my story. But who would believe me? In a world of science and reason, who would accept the existence of a creature that by all rights shouldn't exist? Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring out into the darkness, wondering if somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, that creature is still roaming free. And I can't help but wonder, if such a thing can exist undetected for so long, what other mysteries might be hiding just beyond the edge of our understanding? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the forest the same way again. And if you ever find yourself alone in the wilderness, hearing strange sounds in the night, remember my story, because sometimes The monsters we fear as children turn out to be all too real. Story 15. I've spent my entire career trying to capture the beauty of nature through my camera lens. But on that fateful night in the Appalachian Mountains, I found myself face to face with something that defied explanation. Something that turned my world upside down and made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, a week-long solo camping trip to photograph the autumn foliage in a remote area of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I'd done dozens of trips like this before, always coming back with stunning images of landscapes and wildlife. But this time, I returned with something else entirely. A story that few would believe, and an experience that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The first few days of the trip were uneventful. I hiked deep into the backcountry, setting up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering oaks and maples. Their leaves were a riot of red and gold, creating a canopy of color that took my breath away. I spent my days trekking through the wilderness, capturing the play of light and shadow on the autumn landscape. It was on the fourth night that everything changed. I had just settled into my tent after a long day of shooting when I heard it, a sound unlike anything I'd ever encountered in the wilderness before. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath me. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but as the sound grew closer, I realized it was something else entirely. My heart raced as I lay perfectly still, straining my ears to track the movement outside my tent. Whatever it was big, and it was circling my campsite with deliberate, measured steps. I'd encountered plenty of wildlife in my years as a nature photographer: bears, mountain lions, even the occasional wolf. But this was different. There was an intelligence to its movements, a purposefulness that sent chills down my spine. For what felt like hours, I remained frozen in my sleeping bag, barely daring to breathe as the creature continued its patrol around my tent. Eventually, the footsteps receded, and an uneasy silence fell over the camp. I didn't sleep a wink that night, my mind racing with possibilities. What had I just encountered? Was it some undiscovered species, or was my imagination simply running wild in the darkness of the wilderness? As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I cautiously unzipped my tent and peered outside. The clearing looked undisturbed, but as I stepped out, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A set of tracks in the soft earth around my campsite. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, larger than a man's footprint, but distinctly bipedal, with long, curved claws leaving deep impressions in the soil. But it was the stride length that truly shocked me. Whatever had made these tracks was capable of covering enormous distances with each step. My hands shook as I grabbed my camera, snapping photo after photo of the prints before they could be disturbed by the morning breeze. As a wildlife photographer, I'd learned to trust my instincts, and every fiber of my being was screaming that I'd stumbled onto something extraordinary. I spent the morning examining the tracks, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They led in a wide circle around my camp before disappearing into the dense underbrush. I was tempted to follow them, to see where they might lead, but a primal fear held me back. Whatever had made those prints was still out there, and I wasn't sure I was prepared to face it in the light of day. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I forced myself to focus on my assignment. I packed up my gear and headed deeper into the forest, my camera at the ready. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent my heart racing. I tried to lose myself in my work, framing shots of the vibrant foliage and the rugged mountain landscape. But my mind kept wandering back to those tracks, to the creature that had stalked my camp in the night. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, I knew I had to make a decision. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to pack up and leave, to get back to civilization and forget this whole strange encounter. But the part of me that had always been drawn to the unknown, the part that had led me to become a nature photographer in the first place, couldn't let it go. I had to know what was out there. I made my way back to my campsite, my senses on high alert. As I approached the clearing, I noticed something different. A strange stillness had fallen over the forest. The usual chorus of birds and insects had gone silent, as if the entire woodland was holding its breath. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the lengthening shadows, stood a figure that defied description. It was tall, far taller than any man, with a body covered in shaggy, dark fur. But it was the head that truly shocked me. A long canine muzzle protruded from an otherwise humanoid face, with ears that came to sharp points atop its skull. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This was no bear, no known predator of the Appalachian wilderness. This was something straight out of legend, a creature that walked the line between man and beast. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other. I could see intelligence in its eyes, a spark of awareness that was all too human. And in that instant, I knew that I was looking at something that would change our understanding of the natural world forever. My fingers moved of their own accord, fumbling for my camera. This was the shot of a lifetime, the kind of discovery that photographers dream about. If I could just capture one clear image, I could prove to the world that these creatures existed. As I raised the camera to my eye, time seemed to slow. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears as I adjusted the focus, framing the creature in my viewfinder. It remained eerily still, as if it understood the significance of this moment. Just as my finger tensed on the shutter button, the creature's eyes locked with mine through the lens. In that instant, I felt a connection that transcended species, a moment of mutual recognition and understanding. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. With a speed that seemed impossible for its size, the creature turned and vanished into the forest, leaving nothing but a swaying of branches in its wake. I stood there for what felt like hours, my camera still raised, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. When I finally lowered the camera and checked the display, my heart sank. In my haste and shock, I'd forgotten to adjust for the fading light. The image on the screen was nothing but a dark, blurry shape against the twilight forest. That night, as I huddled in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest, I grappled with what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of the light combined with an overactive imagination, but I knew deep down that what I'd encountered was real. The next morning, I broke camp earlier than planned and began the long hike back to civilization. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere in the dense forest, those intelligent eyes were following my progress. I've spent the years since that encounter trying to make sense of what I saw. I've pored over cryptozoology texts, spoken to experts in the field, and even returned to those mountains a handful of times, always hoping for another glimpse of the creature, but I've never seen it again. The only evidence I have is a blurry photograph and the memories that still wake me in the middle of the night. Sometimes, when I'm out in the wilderness with my camera, I find myself scanning the tree line, hoping for another encounter. And sometimes, in the stillness of the forest, I swear I can hear the echo of that low, guttural growl. I don't know if I'll ever be able to prove what I saw that day in the Appalachian Mountains, but I do know this. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that exist on the fringes of our understanding. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get a glimpse of the mysteries that still lurk in the wild places of the world. So the next time you're out in the wilderness, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched, remember my story, because you never know what might be looking back at you from the shadows of the forest. Story 16. I've always loved the thrill of backcountry skiing, the rush of carving fresh tracks through untouched powder. But after what happened in that abandoned cabin high in the Colorado Rockies, I don't think I'll ever look at the mountains the same way again. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and some terrors once experienced never truly leave you. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. Me and three of my closest friends, Jake, Sarah, and Mike, had been planning this backcountry ski adventure for months. We were experienced skiers, all of us, with years of backcountry trips under our belts. We thought we were prepared for anything the mountains could throw at us. We couldn't have been more wrong. The first 2 days of our trip were everything we'd hoped for. Blue skies, perfect snow conditions, and terrain that challenged our skills and left us exhilarated. We set up camp each night under a canopy of stars, sharing stories and laughter around the warmth of our portable stove. On the third day, everything changed. We woke to grey skies and a biting wind that cut through our layers like they were tissue paper. As we broke camp and strapped on our skis, I felt a gnawing unease in the pit of my stomach. Something about the day felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Maybe we should head back, I suggested, eyeing the roiling clouds overhead. That storm looks nasty. Jake, always the most gung-ho of our group, just laughed. Come on, Alex. We came here for adventure, didn't we? A little snow won't hurt us. I wish I'd pushed harder, insisted we turn back, but I didn't, and that decision would haunt me for years to come. We'd been skiing for barely an hour when the storm hit. 1 minute we were navigating a challenging descent. The next we were engulfed in a whiteout so thick I could barely see the tips of my skis. The wind howled around us, driving snow and ice into any exposed skin with vicious force. "We need to find shelter," Sarah shouted over the roar of the wind. "We can't stay out here." We huddled together, squinting through the blizzard for any sign of refuge. That's when Mike spotted it, a dark shape looming through the curtain of snow. As we got closer, I realized it was a cabin, old and weathered but still standing. Without hesitation, we made for the structure, practically falling through the door in our haste to escape the storm. As Jake and Mike worked to secure the door against the wind, Sarah and I took stock of our surroundings. The cabin was a single room, dusty and long abandoned. A rusted wood stove sat in one corner, and rough-hewn bunks lined the walls. But it was what covered those walls that made my blood run cold. Every inch of the interior was marked with deep gouges, as if some massive beast had used the cabin as a scratching post. The marks ran from floor to ceiling in places, far higher than any person could reach. "What the hell made these?" Sarah whispered, running her fingers along one of the deeper grooves. "Probably just a bear," Jake said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "This place has been abandoned for years. Animals must use it for shelter sometimes." I wanted to believe him, but as I examined the marks more closely, a chill ran down my spine. These weren't random scratches. There was a pattern to them, almost like a language I couldn't quite understand. As the day wore on, and the storm showed no signs of abating, we settled in for what we hoped would be a short stay. We melted snow for water, rationed out our remaining food, and tried to ignore the oppressive feeling of being watched that seemed to permeate the cabin. Night fell, plunging us into a darkness so complete it felt almost alive. We huddled around the weak flame of our camping lantern, telling stories to keep our spirits up. But every creak of the cabin's timbers, every howl of wind, set our nerves on edge. It was just past midnight when we heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We froze, eyes wide in the dim light of the lantern. "Did you hear that?" Mike whispered, his face pale. Before anyone could answer, it came again, louder this time, and with it, the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving across the cabin's roof. Sarah let out a strangled whimper. "There's something up there." We scrambled for our packs, fumbling for anything we could use as a weapon. I gripped my avalanche shovel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my heart pounding in my chest. The sounds above us grew more frantic, as if whatever was up there was searching for a way in. Then, with a crash that shook the entire cabin, something landed on the small porch outside. The door began to rattle violently, the rusted hinges screaming in protest. We backed away, pressing ourselves against the far wall of the cabin. I could hear Sarah praying under her breath, her words a frantic, desperate mantra. Just when I thought the door would give way, everything went silent. The sudden absence of sound was almost more terrifying than the cacophony that had preceded it. For what felt like hours, we stood there, barely breathing, straining our ears for any sign of the creature's return. Gradually, the normal sounds of the storm reasserted themselves. The howl of the wind, the creaking of the cabin's timbers. What? What was that? Jake finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't know," I replied, surprised at how steady my own voice sounded. "But I don't think we're alone out here." We spent the rest of the night in tense silence, jumping at every sound. None of us slept, our eyes fixed on the door, waiting for it to burst open at any moment. When dawn finally broke, casting weak grey light through the cabin's grimy windows, we made a grim discovery. The porch outside was covered in tracks, massive, clawed prints that looked like no animal I'd ever seen. They circled the cabin several times before disappearing into the woods. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. Everything was covered in a thick blanket of pristine snow. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Now, it just felt oppressive, hiding whatever horrors might be lurking just out of sight. We didn't waste any time. We packed up our gear and were on our skis within minutes, all thoughts of continuing our trip forgotten. Our only goal now was to get back to civilization as quickly as possible. As we made our way down the mountain, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide glowing eyes, every rustle of branches a potential threat. We skied harder and faster than we ever had before, pushing ourselves to the limit of exhaustion. It wasn't until we reached the trailhead, our car a welcome sight in the parking lot, that we finally allowed ourselves to relax. The drive back to Denver was subdued, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We tried to rationalize what had happened, to come up with logical explanations for the scratches, the sounds, the tracks. But deep down, we all knew we'd encountered something that defied explanation. In the years since that trip, I've done a lot of research. I've read about cryptid sightings in the Rocky Mountains, about legends of creatures that roam the high, lonely places where humans rarely venture. Some call it the Wendigo, others have different names for it. But all the stories share a common thread, a sense of ancient, primal terror that lingers long after the encounter. I don't go backcountry skiing anymore. The mountains have lost their allure for me, the untouched powder no longer enticing, because now I know that there are things out there in the wilderness, things that have existed long before us and will continue long after we're gone. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself back in that cabin in my dreams. I hear the scratching on the roof, feel the vibration of that unearthly growl, and I wake up in a cold sweat, grateful for the solid walls around me and the comforting sounds of the city. But even here in the heart of civilization, I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, I'll come face to face with that creature again. And next time, a flimsy cabin door might not be enough to keep it at bay. So if you ever find yourself in the backcountry and you hear something that doesn't quite fit, something that sends a chill down your spine despite yourself, remember my story. And remember that sometimes the old legends are more than just stories. Sometimes the monsters are real. Story 17. I've seen my fair share of destruction in my years with the Forest Service, but nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered in the smoldering aftermath of the Cascade Ridge fire. Some scars run deeper than charred earth and toppled trees. Some secrets, once unearthed, can never be buried again. It was supposed to be a routine post-fire inspection. The Cascade Ridge fire had raged for weeks, consuming thousands of acres of pristine wilderness before finally being brought under control. My job was simple: assess the damage, mark hazardous areas, and begin planning for restoration efforts. I'd done this countless times before. It was always a somber task, witnessing the aftermath of nature's fury. But there was also a sense of hope in these inspections. Forests have a way of rebounding, of finding life even in the most desolate circumstances. But as I made my way through the ash-covered landscape that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't quite explain. Every snapping twig under my boots, every shift of settling ash, sent a jolt of unease through my body. I'd been hiking for about 2 hours when I saw them, a set of footprints pressed into the soft ash. At first, I thought they must belong to another member of the inspection team, but as I got closer, my breath caught in my throat. These weren't the prints of standard-issue Forest Service boots. They were bare feet, enormous bare feet, with 5 distinct toes clearly visible in the grey powder. And they were fresh, the edges still crisp and undisturbed by wind or wildlife. I knelt down, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Each print was easily twice the size of my own foot, the stride length indicating a creature of impossible height. Whatever had made these tracks had passed through here very recently, perhaps only hours before. A chill ran down my spine, despite the lingering heat from the fire-baked earth. I'd heard stories, of course, whispered legends of creatures that roamed these forests long before humans arrived, but I'd always dismissed them as campfire tales, the kind of thing you use to scare rookies on their first backcountry assignment. Now, faced with undeniable evidence, I wasn't so sure. I snapped a few photos with my phone, my hands shaking slightly as I tried to frame the prints next to my own boot for scale. Then, against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I began to follow the trail. The tracks led me deeper into the burn zone, away from the designated inspection routes. The devastation here was near total. The once lush forest reduced to a lunar landscape of ash and blackened tree trunks. It was disorienting, like walking through a world drained of color and life. As I pressed on, I began to notice other signs: branches broken far higher than any human could reach, claw marks gouged into the few trees left standing. Whatever had come through here was big and powerful, and unlike anything I'd encountered in my years in the wilderness. The sun was dipping low on the horizon when I saw it, a crude structure nestled in a small hollow, partially shielded from the fire's wrath by a natural rock formation. At first glance, it looked like a jumble of branches and debris, but as I got closer, I realized it was a shelter, carefully constructed to blend in with its surroundings. My heart pounded as I approached. This was far beyond the scope of my inspection duties, but curiosity drove me forward. I had to know what I was dealing with. The shelter was larger than it first appeared, easily big enough to accommodate something 7 or 8 feet tall. The entrance was low, forcing me to crouch as I peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The interior was lined with animal hides, some fresh, others ancient and cracked with age. Bones of various sizes were carefully arranged in patterns I couldn't begin to understand, but it was the far wall that truly shocked me. A collection of crude stone tools lay neatly organized, some still bearing traces of what looked disturbingly like blood. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This was no bear den, no temporary refuge of some woodland creature. This was a home, a lair crafted by intelligent hands. As the implications of what I'd discovered began to sink in, a sound froze me in place, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I turned slowly, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. And there, not 20 feet away, stood something that shouldn't exist. It was tall, far taller than any man I'd ever seen, its body covered in a patchwork of fur and scars. The face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with eyes that glowed with an unsettling intelligence. In one massive hand, it clutched a crude spear, the tip wickedly sharp. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other. I could see the creature assessing me, its eyes roving over my uniform, lingering on the radio clipped to my belt. There was curiosity in that gaze, but also unmistakable threat. I knew I should run, should call for help, do something. But I was rooted to the spot, my body refusing to obey the frantic commands of my mind. The creature took a step forward, its movements surprisingly graceful for its size. I flinched, certain that my life was about to end in this ash-covered hollow. My body added to the grisly collection in the shelter behind me. But instead of attacking, the creature simply sniffed. Its nostrils flared as it took in my scent, head tilting slightly to one side in what looked almost like confusion. Then, with a speed that belied its massive size, it turned and vanished into the charred forest. The only evidence it had ever been there were the massive footprints left in the ash. I don't know how long I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, before I finally managed to fumble for my radio. My hands shook so badly I could barely press the call button. "Base, this is Ranger Matthews," I managed, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. I need immediate extraction." "Over." The response was immediate, laced with concern. "Copy that, Matthews. What's your situation? Over." I opened my mouth to explain, then hesitated. What could I possibly say? That I'd stumbled upon the lair of a creature that shouldn't exist. That I'd come face to face with something that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I've discovered something," I finally said. "Something that needs to be seen to be believed. Send a team and bring tranquilizer guns, just in case." The next few hours passed in a blur. I waited by the shelter, jumping at every sound, half convinced the creature would return at any moment. When the extraction team finally arrived, led by my supervisor, I could see the skepticism in their eyes as I recounted my experience. But the evidence was undeniable. The footprints, the shelter, the tools, it all pointed to something beyond our current understanding. As we carefully documented the scene, I could see the disbelief on my colleagues' faces slowly give way to a mix of wonder and fear. We never saw the creature again, despite extensive searches of the area in the weeks that followed. But we found other signs, more shelters hidden deep in the wilderness, areas where the forest seemed to have been deliberately shaped over decades, perhaps even centuries. The official report buried most of the details, chalking it up to an unidentified species, possibly displaced by the fire, but those of us who were there that day know the truth. There's something out there in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, something ancient and intelligent that has managed to stay hidden from human eyes for generations. I still work for the Forest Service, but my job has changed. Now, I'm part of a small, secret team dedicated to studying and protecting these creatures. We monitor vast stretches of wilderness, always watching for signs of their presence, always ready to misdirect hikers or campers who stray too close to their territory. Sometimes, on quiet nights in the backcountry, I think I hear that low growl again, feel the weight of those intelligent eyes watching me from the shadows. And I'm reminded that there are still mysteries in this world, still wonders and terrors lurking just beyond the edge of firelight. So the next time you're in the wilderness, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched, remember my story, because you never know what ancient eyes might be looking back at you from the depths of the forest. Story 18. I've always considered myself a seasoned outdoorsman, but nothing in my years of camping and hiking could have prepared me for that night in the Adirondacks. It's one thing to know that wilderness holds dangers. It's another to come face to face with something that shouldn't exist. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of those eyes staring back at me in the moonlight. My buddy Dave and I had been planning this trip for months. We were both experienced campers, but this was our first time tackling a more remote area of the Adirondack high peaks. We'd packed all the essentials: bear-resistant food canisters, topographic maps, emergency beacons, the works. We thought we were ready for anything the mountains could throw at us. We couldn't have been more wrong. The first 2 days of our trek were everything we'd hoped for. The weather was perfect, clear blue skies stretching endlessly above us as we navigated challenging trails and set up camp each night under a canopy of stars. We saw plenty of wildlife, deer, a few black bears in the distance, even a fox that darted across our path one afternoon. It was exactly the kind of wilderness experience we'd been craving. On the third night, we made camp in a small clearing near a babbling brook. As the sun dipped below the tree line, we went through our usual routine, setting up the tent, gathering firewood and securing our food cache about 100 yards from our sleeping area. "You think we'll have any ursine visitors tonight?" Dave joked as we hoisted our food bags into a tall pine. I laughed, giving the rope one final tug to make sure it was secure. "Probably not, but better safe than sorry. I'd rather not wake up to a bear ransacking our campsite. If only we'd known what was really waiting for us in the darkness." We spent the evening around the campfire, swapping stories and planning our route for the next day. As the fire died down to embers, we doused it completely and crawled into our tent, the sounds of the forest lulling us to sleep. I'm not sure what woke me first, the noise or the sudden absence of it. One moment, the night was filled with the usual chorus of insects and the gentle rustle of wind through the trees. The next, an eerie silence had fallen over our campsite, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a heavy shuffling punctuated by the snap of branches. Something big was moving through the underbrush, heading straight for our food cache. "Dave," I whispered, shaking my friend's shoulder, "wake up. I think we've got company." Dave stirred groggily. "What? Bear?" "I don't know," I replied, already reaching for the flashlight and bear spray we kept by the tent entrance. "But whatever it is, it's going for our food." We unzipped the tent as quietly as possible, emerging into the moonlit clearing. The air felt charged, heavy with a tension I couldn't quite explain. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw movement near our food cache. At first glance, I thought it was a bear. It was certainly big enough, its shadowy form looming larger than any black bear I'd encountered before. But as we crept closer, bear spray at the ready, I realized something was off about its shape. It was then that the creature turned, and I felt my heart stop. This was no bear. The thing stood on two legs, its body covered in shaggy fur that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. But it was the face that truly shocked me. A bizarre blend of human and canine features, with the elongated snout and ears that came to sharp points atop its head. For a long moment, we all stood frozen. I could hear Dave's ragged breathing beside me, could feel the tremor in my own hand as I gripped the bear spray. The creature stared back at us, its eyes glinting with an intelligence that was decidedly unhuman. Then, with agonizing slowness, it began to turn towards us. "Oh, shit," Dave whispered, his voice barely audible. "What the fuck is that thing?" I couldn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, some kind of waking nightmare brought on by altitude sickness or tainted water. But as the creature took a step in our direction, I knew with terrifying certainty that this was all too real. "Easy," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm, despite the panic coursing through me. "Nice. Doggy?" The absurdity of my words hit me as soon as they left my mouth. This thing was no dog, no bear, no anything I'd ever seen before. It was something straight out of legend, a creature that shouldn't exist outside of campfire stories and folklore. The beast cocked its head at the sound of my voice, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. I tensed, certain it was about to charge, but instead it simply studied us. Its eyes roamed over our forms, lingering on the bear spray in my white-knuckled grip. Slowly, deliberately, I began to lower the canister. Some instinct told me that making any sudden moves would be a fatal mistake. "What are you doing?" Dave hissed. "That's our only defense." "I don't think it wants to hurt us," I replied, though I was far from certain. If it did, we'd already be dead. The creature watched this exchange with what looked almost like curiosity. Then, to my utter amazement, it sat back on its haunches, assuming a posture that was eerily reminiscent of a dog waiting for a treat. For what felt like hours, we stood in a surreal standoff. The creature made no move to attack, but it also showed no signs of leaving. It was as if it was waiting for something, though I couldn't begin to guess what. Finally, driven by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, I took a small step forward. "Alex, what the hell are you doing?" Dave's voice was tight with fear. I don't know," I admitted, "but I think it's trying to communicate." As I inched closer, the creature's ears perked up. It made a low sound in its throat, not quite a growl, but not quite anything else I'd ever heard before. Then, with movements that seemed almost hesitant, it reached one massive, clawed hand towards the food cache. Understanding dawned. "It's hungry," I said, more to myself than to Dave. "It just wants food." Moving slowly, telegraphing my movements, I made my way to the food cache. The creature watched my every move, its body tense but not aggressive. With trembling hands, I untied the rope and lowered one of our food bags. "This is insane," Dave muttered from behind me. "We should be running, not feeding it." But something told me that running would be the worst thing we could do. This creature, whatever it was clearly intelligent, and right now it seemed more curious than hostile. I opened the bag and pulled out a package of beef jerky. The creature's nose twitched, and I swear I saw its mouth water. "Here," I said softly, tossing the package towards it. "This is what you want, right?" The beast snatched the jerky out of the air with startling speed. It sniffed the package for a moment, then tore it open with its teeth. As it began to eat, I slowly backed away, returning to Dave's side. We watched in amazed silence as the creature devoured the jerky, licking the wrapper clean when it was done. Then, to our continued astonishment, it carefully placed the empty package on the ground and looked back at us expectantly. "I think it wants more," Dave said, his voice a mix of fear and growing wonder. Over the next hour, we found ourselves in the strangest picnic of our lives. We tossed food to the creature, more jerky, some trail mix, even a few energy bars, and it accepted each offering with what I could only describe as politeness. It never rushed us, never showed aggression. It simply waited patiently for each morsel. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the creature finally seemed satisfied. It rose to its full height, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and gave us one last, long look. Then, with a grace that belied its size, it turned and loped off into the forest, disappearing among the trees as if it had never been there at all. Dave and I stood in stunned silence for a long time after it vanished. Finally, Dave broke the quiet. What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice shaky. I shook my head, still trying to process what we'd just experienced. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I don't think we'll ever forget it. We spent the rest of our trip in a state of hyper-awareness, jumping at every sound, scanning the tree line for any sign of our nocturnal visitor. But we never saw it again. In the years since that night, I've done a lot of research. I've read about cryptid sightings in the Adirondacks, about legends of creatures that roam the deep wilderness. Some call it the Dogman, others have different names. But all the stories share a common thread, an encounter with something that defies explanation, something that blurs the line between myth and reality. I don't know if what we saw that night was the Dogman of legend. I don't know if it was some undiscovered species or something else entirely, but I do know this. There are things out there in the wilderness that we can't explain, things that challenge everything we think we know about the natural world. So the next time you're camping in the backcountry and you hear something moving in the night, remember my story. And remember that sometimes the best course of action isn't to run or to fight. It's to offer a gesture of peace, because you never know when you might be face to face with something straight out of legend. Story 19. I've been hunting these woods since I was old enough to hold a rifle, but nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered that crisp October evening. They say the hunter's moon brings out strange things in the forest. I never believed it until that night, when the line between predator and prey became terrifyingly blurred. It started like any other hunting trip. I'd taken a week off work, packed up my gear, and headed deep into the northern Michigan wilderness. This was my sanctuary, a place where the concerns of the modern world fell away, leaving only the primal dance of hunter and hunted. The first few days were uneventful. I tracked deer through the golden-leaved forests, reveling in the solitude and the sharp autumn air. But as the hunter's moon waxed full, an uneasiness began to creep over me. The forest felt different, The usual chatter of birds and small animals had grown muted, as if the entire woodland was holding its breath. It was on the fourth morning that I found the tracks. I'd risen before dawn, eager to catch the deer on their way to their morning feeding grounds. The forest was shrouded in mist, the trees looming like silent sentinels in the pre-dawn gloom. I moved carefully, my boots crunching softly on the frost-covered leaves. That's when I saw them, a set of prints pressed into a patch of soft earth. At first glance, I thought they might belong to a bear, but as I knelt to examine them more closely, my blood ran cold. These weren't bear tracks, they weren't deer tracks or wolf tracks or anything I'd ever seen before. The prints were enormous, easily twice the size of my own boot, with 5 distinct toe impressions splayed out in a way that was unnervingly human-like. But no human could have left marks like these. I stood slowly, my eyes scanning the surrounding forest. The mist seemed to thicken, tendrils curling around the trees like grasping fingers. For the first time in years, I felt like an intruder in these woods, like prey. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the tracks. They led me deeper into the forest, away from my usual hunting grounds. The terrain grew rougher, the underbrush thicker. Several times I lost the trail, only to pick it up again in patches of mud or areas where the creature, whatever it was, had pushed through dense foliage. As the day wore on, I began to notice other signs. Claw marks gouged into tree trunks far higher than a bear could reach, tufts of coarse, dark hair snagged on branches, and always that feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following my every move. It was late afternoon when I entered the clearing. The mist had mostly burned off, but the air still felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. And there, in the center of the clearing, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The trees surrounding the open space were marked with strange symbols, intricate designs carved deep into the bark, forming patterns that hurt my eyes if I looked at them too long. Some seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, as if they existed in some space between reality and imagination. I approached one of the marked trees, my hand reaching out almost of its own accord to trace the alien curves and angles. As my fingers brushed the carved wood, a jolt ran through me, not pain exactly, but a sensation of wrongness that made my skin crawl. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, my rifle raised, but the clearing was empty. The growl came again, closer this time, and with it a sense of ancient, primal hunger that turned my blood to ice. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, all thoughts of stealth forgotten. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step, but I pushed on. The growl pursued me, sometimes seeming to come from right behind me, sometimes from the trees above. I don't know how long I ran, minutes or hours. It all blurred together in a haze of terror and adrenaline. Finally, gasping for breath, I burst out of the tree line and found myself on the shore of a small lake. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. For a moment, I thought I'd escaped. The forest behind me was silent, no sign of pursuit. I allowed myself to relax, just a fraction. That's when I saw it. On the far side of the lake, a figure emerged from the trees. Even at this distance, I could see that it was massive, far larger than any man. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its size, bipedal, but with a gait that was decidedly inhuman. As it reached the water's edge, it turned its head towards me. Even across the expanse of the lake, I could feel the weight of its gaze. A pair of eyes glowed in the gathering darkness, filled with an intelligence that was anything but animal. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the water. I knew I should run, should try to put as much distance between myself and this impossible creature as I could, but I was rooted to the spot, transfixed by those glowing eyes. Then, with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something so large, the creature plunged into the lake. The water barely seemed to slow it as it powered towards me, closing the distance with terrifying swiftness. That finally broke the spell. I turned and ran back into the forest, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I could hear splashing behind me, then the sound of heavy footsteps on the shore. The creature was in pursuit. I ran blindly through the darkening woods, branches tearing at my clothes, roots threatening to trip me at every step. The sound of my pursuer grew closer with each passing second. I could hear its labored breathing, could almost feel the heat of its presence at my back. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I spotted a flicker of light through the trees. My cabin. I'd circled back around without realizing it. With a final burst of speed, I sprinted for the building, praying I'd reach it before the creature caught up to me. I hit the door at full speed, nearly tearing it off its hinges as I burst inside. I slammed it shut behind me, fumbling with shaking hands to slide the heavy wooden bar into place. For a long moment, there was only the sound of my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Then, a heavy thud against the door. Another. The entire cabin seemed to shake with each impact. I scrambled for my rifle, loading it with trembling fingers. The pounding continued, growing more frenzied with each passing second. I could hear wood splintering, knew that the door wouldn't hold much longer. Just as I raised the rifle, aiming it at the straining door, everything went silent. The pounding stopped as suddenly as it had begun. For several heartbeats, there was no sound at all. Then a low guttural sound from right outside the door. Not quite a growl, not quite speech, but something in between. It rose and fell in a pattern that almost sounded like words, like some ancient language I couldn't begin to comprehend. And then it was gone. I heard heavy footsteps receding into the forest, growing fainter until they faded away entirely. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back to the wall, rifle in my lap, jumping at every creak of the cabin's timbers, every rustle of wind in the trees outside. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally allowed myself to relax, just a fraction. When I finally worked up the courage to venture outside, I found massive footprints circling the cabin. They matched the ones I'd seen in the clearing, but there was something different about them now. The toes seemed more splayed, the shape almost distorted, as if the creature had been in the process of changing form. I left that day, abandoning the rest of my hunting trip. As I drove back towards civilization, my mind raced with questions. What had I encountered in those woods? Was it some undiscovered species, a creature out of legend, or something else entirely, something that defied explanation? I've been back to those woods since then, drawn by a mix of fear and fascination. I've never seen the creature again, but sometimes, on nights when the hunter's moon hangs full and heavy in the sky, I hear that low, guttural sound echoing through the trees, and I know that somewhere out there, in the deep, dark heart of the forest, something is waiting, watching, hungry. So if you ever find yourself in the northern Michigan wilderness and you come across strange tracks or trees marked with symbols that don't quite make sense, remember my story. And remember that in the ancient woods, under the light of the hunter's moon, the line between hunter and hunted can blur in ways you never imagined possible. Story 20. I've been a park ranger for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing in my training could have prepared me for what I encountered in the caves of Echo Mountain. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen, and some horrors, once faced, never truly leave you. It started with a series of strange reports from campers in the area, unusual noises in the night, eerie howls that didn't sound quite animal, quite human. At first, we chalked it up to coyotes or the wind playing tricks. But as the reports became more frequent, more urgent, we knew we had to investigate. I volunteered to check it out. Echo Mountain had always been my favorite part of the park, with its rugged terrain and hidden caves. I'd explored most of those caves over the years, or so I thought. I had no idea what was really lurking in the darkness beneath the mountain. The day started like any other patrol. I packed my gear, checked in with dispatch, and headed out into the wilderness. The late summer air was thick with the scent of pine and wildflowers, the forest alive with the chatter of birds and small animals. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. As I approached the area where most of the disturbances had been reported, that sense of peace began to fade. The forest grew quieter, the air heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were following my every move. I just reached the base of Echo Mountain when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a howl, but unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It started low, almost subsonic, then rose to a pitch that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't a coyote, wasn't a wolf, it was something else. My hand went to the radio at my belt, ready to call for backup, but something stopped me. Call it curiosity, call it stupidity, but I had to know what was making that sound. I followed the noise to the mouth of a cave I'd never noticed before. It was well hidden, obscured by dense underbrush and a fallen tree. As I pushed through the foliage, the smell hit me, a rank, animal odor mixed with something metallic that made my stomach turn. I should have turned back then, should have called for help, waited for a team, but I didn't. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped into the cave. The beam of light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, barely penetrating a few feet ahead. The air grew colder as I moved deeper into the cave, the silence broken only by the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance and my own echoing footsteps. That's when I saw them. The tents, or what was left of them. Shredded fabric and bent poles scattered across the cave floor, surrounded by abandoned camping gear. My heart raced as I examined the scene. This wasn't animal damage. The tents looked like they'd been torn apart by something with immense strength and purpose. I swept my flashlight around the cave, looking for any sign of the campers. That's when I spotted the backpack, partially hidden behind a rock formation. I approached it cautiously, already dreading what I might find. The backpack was torn, its contents spilled across the rocky ground. Among the scattered gear, something caught my eye, a camera. With trembling hands, I picked it up. It was one of those rugged models designed for outdoor use. Miraculously, it still had power. I shouldn't have looked at those photos. Sometimes I wish I could erase them from my memory. But once seen, they couldn't be unseen. The first few images were typical vacation shots, smiling faces, beautiful vistas, campfire scenes. But then they changed. Blurry shots of something moving in the darkness, a massive, shadowy figure at the edge of the campsite, and then horror. The last photo showed a creature straight out of nightmare. It was hunched over one of the tents, its body a mass of matted fur and rippling muscle. But it was the face that truly chilled me to the core, elongated, almost canine, with eyes that glowed red in the camera flash, and its mouth, dear God, its mouth was full of teeth sharper than any natural predator's, dripping with what could only be blood. I dropped the camera, my hands shaking uncontrollably. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hoax, a sick prank. But deep down, I knew. I knew that what I'd seen in that photo was real, and I knew it was still here, somewhere in these caves. That's when I heard it, the growl, low, guttural, and terrifyingly close. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the cave walls, and there, in the shadows beyond the reach of my light, I saw a pair of glowing eyes. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Training, duty, curiosity, all of it went out the window in the face of primal terror. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, driven by the sound of heavy footsteps and that bone-chilling growl behind me. I burst out of the cave into the fading daylight, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I reached my vehicle, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock the door and throw myself inside. As I sped down the mountain road, my radio crackled to life. It was dispatch, asking for a status update. For a long moment, I sat there, unsure of what to say. How could I explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? In the end, I reported finding signs of animal activity and some abandoned camping gear. I said I'd need a team to help investigate further. It wasn't a lie, not exactly, but it was far from the whole truth. That night, as I sat in my cabin trying to write up my report, I couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes, that mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. I knew I should tell someone, should report everything I'd seen. But who would believe me? And more importantly, what would happen if they did? I've been back to Echo Mountain many times since that day. We never found any trace of the missing campers. The official report chalks it up to a bear attack, with the victims likely dragged off into the wilderness. But I know the truth. I've seen what really lurks in those caves. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I can still hear that howl echoing across the valley. It sends shivers down my spine every time, because I know that somewhere out there, in the dark places beneath the mountain, something is waiting, watching, hungry. I've never told anyone the full story of what I saw in those caves. Who would believe me? But I'm sharing it now as a warning. If you ever find yourself in the wilderness around Echo Mountain, and you hear strange noises in the night, don't investigate. Don't let curiosity get the better of you, because some things are better left undiscovered. Some predators are better left undisturbed. And if you see a cave mouth hidden by undergrowth, smell that rank animal odor mixed with something metallic, turn back. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because what's waiting in that darkness isn't something from our world. It's something older, something primal, something that sees us not as rangers or campers or hikers, but as prey. I still do my job. I still patrol the park, still help lost hikers and chase off troublesome wildlife. But I never go into the caves anymore. And on nights when the moon is full and that howl echoes across the valley, I lock my doors, check my weapon, and pray that whatever is out there stays in the darkness where it belongs. Because once you've seen what I've seen, you never really feel safe in the wilderness again. You never shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the shadows just beyond the firelight, something is watching, waiting. And one day, it might decide to come out of the caves and into our world. So if you're ever hiking in these parts and you think you hear something strange, something that doesn't quite fit, remember my story. And remember that sometimes the monsters we fear as children turn out to be all too real. They're just waiting for us to stumble into their domain, to become part of the legend that the rangers whisper about but never fully explain. Stay safe out there. And whatever you do, stay out of the caves.